Chapter 17 of The Southerner by Thomas Dixon, a romance of the real Lincoln. Chapter 17, The Day's Work. Betty Winter held John Vaughan's note in her hand, staring at its message with increasing amazement. Dear little sweetheart, the President has just called General McClellan again to the chief command. His act vindicates my loyalty. Our quarrel is too absurd. Life is too short, dear, for this. It's only long enough to love. May I see you at once? Signed, John. Could it be true? For a moment she refused to believe it. The President had expressed to her his deep conviction of McClellan's guilt. How could he reverse his position on so vital and tremendous a matter overnight? And yet John Vaughan was incapable of the cheap trick of lying to make an engagement. A newsboy passed, yelling an extra. Extra, extra, General McClellan again in the saddle, extra. It was true. He had made the appointment. What was its meaning? Had they forced the President into this humiliating act? If the general were really guilty of destroying Pope and overwhelming the army in defeat, his treachery had created the crisis which forced his return to power. The return under such conditions would not be a vindication. It would be a conviction of crime. She would see the President at once and know the truth. The question cut the center of John Vaughan's character. The orderly who brought the note was waiting for an answer. She called from the head of the stairs. Tell Mr. Vaughan that there is no answer today. Yes, miss. With a quick salute he passed out, and Betty stood irresolute as she listened to the echo of his horse's hoofbeats growing fainter. It was only 6 o'clock, but the days were getting shorter and it was already dark. She could walk quickly down Pennsylvania Avenue and reach the White House before dinner. He would see her at any hour. In 5 minutes she was on her way, her mind a whirl of speculation on the intrigue which might lie behind that sensational announcement. She was beginning to suspect her lover's patriotism. A man could love the South, fight and die for it, and be a patriot. He was dying for what he believed to be right, God and his country. But no man could serve two masters. Her blood boiled at the thought of a conspiracy within the lines of the Union, whose purpose was to betray its chief. If John Vaughan were in it, she loved him with every beat of her heart, but she would cut her heart out sooner than sink to his level. She became conscious at last of the brazen stares of scores of brutal-looking men who thronged to the sidewalks of the avenue. Gambling dens had grown here like mushrooms during the past year of war's fevered life. The vice and crime of the whole North and West had poured into Washington, now swarming with 250,000 strange people. The capital was no longer a city of 60,000 inhabitants, but a vast frontier post and pay station of the army, and such a pay station. Each day the expenditures of the government were more than 2 millions. The air was electric with the mad lust for gain, which the scent of millions excites in the nostrils of the wolves who prey on their fellow men. The streets swarmed with these hungry beasts, male and female. They pushed and crowded and jostled each other from the sidewalks. The roar of their whiskey-laden voices poured forth from every bar room and gambling den on the avenue. A fat contractor who had made his pile in pasteboard soles for army shoes and sent more boys to the grave from disease than had been killed in battle, touched elbows with the hook-nosed vulture, who was sporting a diamond pin, bought with the profits of shoddy clothes that had proven a shroud for many a brave soldier sleeping in a premature grave. They were laughing, drinking, smoking, swearing, gambling, and all shouting for the flag that was waving over millions they hoped yet to share. Feeling of sickening fear swept the girl's heart. For the first time in her life, she was afraid to be alone on the brightly lighted streets of Washington at dusk. The poison of death was in the air. Every desperate passion that stirs the brute in man was written in the bloodshot eyes that sought hers. The nation was at war. To cheat, deceive, entrap, maim, kill the enemy, and lay his home in desolation was the daily business now of millions who backed the government. Whatever the lofty aims of either of the contending hosts, they sought to win by war, and this was war. It was not to be wondered at that this spirit should begin to poison the springs of life in the minds of the weak and send them forth to prey on their fellows. It was not to be wondered at that men planned in secret to advance their own interests at the expense of their fellows to climb the ladder of wealth and fame in this black hour, no matter on whose dead bodies they had to walk. With a pang of positive terror, Betty asked herself the question whether the man she loved had been touched by this deadly pestilence. A wave of horror swept her. A drunken brute brushed by and thrust his bloated face into hers. With a cry of rage and fear, she turned and ran for 2 blocks, left the avenue at the corner, and hurried back to her home. She would wait until morning and see the president before the crowd arrived. He greeted her with a joyous shout. "Come right in, Miss Betty." With long, quick strides, he met her and grasped her hands, a kindly twinkle in his eye. "And how's our old grizzly bear, your father, this morning?" "He's alive and still growling," she laughed. The president joined heartily. "I'll bet he is," he said, "and hates me just as cordially as ever." Betty nodded. But his beautiful daughter was never more loyal to her chief. "Good. And my administration is on a sound basis. You want no office, you ask no favors. Such clear, pure young eyes in the morning of life don't make mistakes. They know." "But I've come to ask you something this morning." The smile faded into a look of seriousness. "What's the matter?" Betty hesitated, and the red blood slowly mounted to her cheeks. He led her to a seat beside his chair, touched her hand gently, and whispered, "Tell me." "I hope you won't think me presumptuous, Mr. President, but I ask you to tell me why you recall General McClellan." The rugged face suddenly flashed with a smile. "Presumptuous? My dear child, if you could have heard a few things that my cabinet had to say to me in this room on that subject. The tender deference with which you put the question is the nearest thing to an endorsement I have so far received. Go as far as you like after that opening. It would be a joy to discuss it with you. Presumptuous, oh my soul." He caught his knee between his hands and rocked with laughter at the memory of the cabinet scene. Reassured by his manner, Betty leaned closer. "You remember the morning you gave me the pass to Alexandria to see a certain young man?" "Yes, perfectly." "You distinctly gave me the impression that morning that you were sure General McClellan was betraying his trust in his failure to support General Pope, and that your confidence in him was gone forever." "Did I?" "Yes." "Then it wasn't far from the truth," he gravely admitted. "And yet you recalled him to the command of the army?" "I had to." "Had to?" "It was the only thing to do." Betty spoke in a whisper. "You mean that their conspiracies become so dangerous there is no other way?" He threw her a searching look, was silent a moment, and slowly said, "That's a pointed question, isn't it?" "I'm a member of the cabinet, you know." "Yes, I know, but why do you happen to ask me such a dangerous question at this particularly trying moment? Come, my little bright eyes, out with it." "A certain young man and I are not very happy." "You quarreled?" "Yes." "About what?" "You." "You don't mean it, Miss Betty," he said incredulously. Her eyes were dim and she nodded. "But why about me?" "I saw things which confirmed your suspicion." He admitted his desire that General Pope should fail and defended McClellan's indifference. "We quarreled. I asked him to resign from the staff of his chief." "You didn't," he exclaimed softly, his deep eyes shining. "I did, and he refused." Again the big hands closed on hers. "God bless you, child. So long as I hold such faith from hearts like yours, I know that I'm right. They can say whatever they please about me." "You see," she broke in, "if he is in this conspiracy and they have forced you to surrender, he is equally guilty of treachery. And you hold him responsible for his commander's ambitions?" "Yes." The president sprang to his feet and paced the floor a moment, stopped and gazed at her with a look of curious tenderness. "By jinks, Miss Betty, if I had a few more like you in my cabinet, I wouldn't be so lonesome." "They didn't force you?" "Not as you mean it, my child. I'm not going to pretend to you that I don't understand the seriousness of the situation. The Army of the Potomac is behind McClellan to a man. It amounts to infatuation. I sounded his officers, I sounded his men. Today they are against me and with him. If the issue could be sprung, if the leaders dared to risk their necks on such a revolution, they might win. They don't know this as clearly as I do because they are not so well informed. They are afraid to move. I've chosen to beat 'em at their own game." He paused and laughed. "I hate to shatter your ideal, Miss Betty, but I'm afraid there's something of the fox in my makeup after all. Would it shock you to learn this?" "I shall be greatly relieved to know it," she responded firmly. "Think, then, for a moment. I suspend McClellan for his failure and replace him with a man I believe to be his superior. The Army sullenly resists this change. They don't agree with me. They believe McClellan is the greatest general in sight. It's a marvelous thing, this power over men, which he possesses. It can even be used to create a nation or to destroy one. It's a dangerous force. I must handle it with the utmost care. So long as their idol is a martyr, the army is unfit for good service. The moment I restore the old commander, in whom both officers and men have unbounded faith, I show them that I am beyond his influence of the political forces which demand his destruction, don't I? Yes. And the moment I dare to brave popular disapproval and restore their commander, don't you see that I win the confidence of the army in my fairness and my disinterested patriotism? Of course. See then what must happen. Now mind you, I would never have restored McClellan to command if I did not know that at this moment he can do the work of putting this disorganized and defeated army into fighting shape better than any other. McClellan, thus returned to power, must fight. He must win or lose. If he wins, I'm vindicated, and his success is mine. If he loses his power over the imagination of his men, and I at last shall master the situation. I shall back him with every dollar and every man the nation can send in his next campaign. No matter whether he wins or loses, I must win, because the supremacy of the civil power will be restored." "I see," Betty breathed softly. She rose with a new look of reverence for the great mind. "And the civil power was not supreme when you restored McClellan to his command? Miss Betty, you'd make a good lawyer." He laughed. "Was it? No. Thank you," she said, rising and extending her hand. "I learned exactly what I wished to know." "And you'll stop quarreling?" "If he's reasonable." He lifted his long finger in solemn warning. "Remember now, the administration is honestly and sincerely backing General McClellan for all it's worth. It has always done this. We are going to try to make an even better record in the next campaign." "When will it open?" "Sooner than any of us wish it. If our scouts report the truth, flushed with his great victory over Pope, General Lee is sure to invade Maryland. The campaign will be a dangerous and crucial one. The moment Lee crosses the Potomac, his communications with Richmond will be imperiled. If he dares to do it, we can crush his army in a great battle, cut his communications with Richmond, drive his men into the Potomac, and end this war. I've given McClellan the opportunity of his life. I pray to God to give success." Edward appeared at the door. "Well, what is it?" "Crowd, sir. They are clamoring to get in." Betty hurried into the family apartment to speak to Mrs. Lincoln, her mind in a whirl of resentment against John Vaughan. The president turned to the crowd, which had already poured into the room. As usual, the cranks and inventors led the way. The inventors found the president an easy man to talk to. His mind was quick to see a good point and always open to conviction. He had once patented a device for getting flatboats over the shoals himself. His immediate approval was the first model of Ericsson's famous monitor had led to its adoption in time to meet and destroy the Merrimac and Hampton Roads on the very day the Iron Terror had sent his big ships to the bottom. He allowed no inventor to be turned from the door of the White House, no matter how ridiculous his hobby might appear. The inventions relating to the science of war he would test himself on the big open field between the White House grounds and the river. The first inventor with line carried a model of a new rifle, which would shoot 16 times. The Army officers believed in the idea of a single-shell breech loader on the account of the simplicity of its mechanism. Our muskets were still muzzle loaders, and the men were compelled to use ramrods to load. The president examined the new gun with keen interest, pulled his black, shaggy beard thoughtfully, looked at the breathless inventor, and slowly mused. "Well, now, as the fat girl said when she pulled on her stocking, it strikes me there's something in it." The inventor laughed with nervous joy and watched him write a card of endorsement. Take that to the War Department and tell them I like your idea. I want them to look into it. His face wreathed in smiles. The man pushed his way through the crowd and hurried to the War Department. The next one was a little fellow who had a gun of marvelous model, double-barreled, with the barrels crossed. The president adjusted his spectacles and took a second look before he made any comment. He lifted his bristling eyebrows. "What's that for?" "For cross-eyed men, sir," he whispered. "You don't say," he roared. "Yes, sir. The cross-eyed men ain't never had no chance in this war. They turn 'em all down. They won't take 'em as soldiers. That gun'll fix 'em. Put a regiment of good cross-eyed men to the front with that gun a-pouring hot lead from 2 barrels at the same time, and every man or cross-firing the enemy will just naturally make hash at 'em, sir. And we may need the cross-eyed men, too, before this war ends." The somber eyes twinkled thoughtfully. "Thank you, my friend. When I draft the cross-eyed men, come in again and we'll talk it over. Your heart's in the right place, anyhow." He glanced doubtfully at the little skillet-shaped head and reached over his shoulder for the next one. It was a bulletproof shirt for soldiers, a coat of mail which weighed 50 pounds. "How long do you think a man could march with that thing on and the thermometer at 98 in the shade?" He handed it back with a shake of his head and grabbed the next one, a model watertight canoe to fit the foot like a snowshoe. "What's the idea?" he asked. "Shoe the army with my canoes, sir. They can all walk on water. And yet they say the age of miracles is past. Take it over to old Neptune's office. He's a sad man at times, and I like him. That ought to cheer him up." The next one was a man of unusually interesting face. A typical Yankee farmer with whiskers spilling over his collar from his neck and bristling up against his clean-shaven skin. He handed the president a model of a new musket. He examined it with care and fixed the man with his gaze. "Well, sir?" "It's the recall, sir," he explained softly. "It's the way she's hung on the stock." "Oh?" "You see, sir," he went on earnestly, "a gun ought not to recoil. And if it recoils at all, it ought to hit recoil a little forward." "Right you are," the president roared with laughter. "Your logic's sound whether your gun kicks or not. I say so, too. A gun ought not to recoil at all, and if it does recoil, by jinks, it ought to recoil and hit the other feller, not us." The tall figure dropped into the chair by his desk and laughed again. "Come in, Brother Recoil, and we'll talk about it when I've got more time." The stocky, heavy-set figure of the Secretary of War suddenly pushed through the crowd and up to the desk. Stanton's manner had always been rude to the point of brusqueness and insult. The tremendous power he was now wielding in the most important department of government had not softened his temper or improved his manners. The president had learned to appreciate his matchless industry and sterling honesty and overlooked his faults as an indulgent father, those of a passionate and willful child. Stanton's eyes were flashing through his gold-rimmed glasses, the wrath he found difficult to express. The president looked up with a friendly smile. "Well, Mars, what's the trouble now?" Stanton shook his leonine locks and beard in fury at the use of the facetious word. He loathed levity of any kind, and the one kind he could not endure was the quip that came his way. He regarded himself seriously every day, every hour, every minute and every hour. He was the incarnate soul of Mars on Earth. He knew it and felt it. He raged at the president's use of the term because he had a sneaking idea he was being laughed at, and that by a man who was his inferior, and yet to whom he was rendering indispensable service. An angry retort rose to his lips, but he suppressed the impulse. It was a waste of breath. The president was a fool. He would only laugh again as he had done before, and so he plunged straight to the purpose of his call. "Before you get to your usual batch of passes and pardons this morning, I want to protest again, Mr. President, against your persistent interference with the discipline of the Army and the affairs of my department. Your pardons are hamstringing the whole service, sir. It must stop if you expect your generals to control their men." "Is that all, Mars?" the even voice said. "It is, sir." "Well, thank you for your spirit that prompts your rage. I know you're right about most of these things. I'll do my best to help and not hinder you. There's a woman coming here this morning to present a petition over my head." "Oh, I see. I have refused it, and I demand that you support, not make a fool of me." He turned without waiting for an answer and strode from the room. The president whispered to Nicolay, "We may have to put a few bricks in Stanton's pocket again, John." He glanced towards the waiting crowd and whispered again, Any news today from the front before I go on? Nicolay drew a telegram from his file. Only this dispatch, sir, announcing the capture of 50 mules and 2 brigadier generals by Stuart's cavalry. 50 mules and 2 brigadier generals. 50 mules, and they're worth $200 apiece. Tell them to send a regiment after those mules. Jeff D. can have the generals. A slender, little dark-haired girl, about 15 years old, with big, wistful blue eyes, had taken advantage of the pause to slip close. When the president lifted his head, she caught his eyes. He rose immediately and drew her to his side. You're all alone, little girl? Yes, sir, she faltered. What can I do for you? If you please, I want to pass through the lines to Virginia. My brother's there. He was shot in the last battle. I want to see him. Of course you do, the kindly voice agreed, and you shall. He wrote the pass and handed it to her. She murmured her thanks, and he placed his big hand on her dark head and asked casually, Of course you're loyal. The young lips quivered. She hesitated and looked up to his face through dimmed eyes, and the slender body suddenly stiffened as she slowly said, Yes, to the heart's core, to Virginia. The trembling fingers handed the pass back, and the tears rolled down her cheeks. The tall man dared not look down again. Something about this slim, wistful girl brought back over the years the memory of the young mother who had come from the hills of old Virginia. He was still for a moment, stooped and took her hand in his. His voice was low and tender and full of feeling. I know what it cost you to say that, child. You're a brave, glorious little girl if you are a rebel. I love you for this glimpse you've given me of a great spirit. I'm sure I can trust you. If I let you go, you will promise me faithfully that no word shall pass your lips of what you've seen inside our lines. I promise. She cried, smiling through her tears. He handed her back the pass and slowly said, May God bless you. Speed the day when your people and mine shall no longer be enemies. He turned again to the desk, and beside it stood a quiet woman dressed in black. And how shall I serve you, madam? She smiled hopefully. You have children, Mr. President? A look of sorrow overspread his dark face. Yes. I have 2 boys now. I had 3, but God has just taken one of them. I had 2. The mother responded. Both of them went into the army to fight for their country and left me alone. One has been killed in battle. Tried to be brave about it. I said over and over again, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed is the name of the Lord. But I had to give up. I'm all alone in my little place in the mountains of Pennsylvania, and I can't endure it. I know they say I have no right to ask, but I want my last boy to come home. All night I lie back there and cry, Can't you let me have my boy back? He's all I've got on earth. Others have more. I have only this one. I'm just a woman, lonely, heart-sick, and afraid. They say I can't have him, but I've come to ask you. I've heard you have a loving heart. She stopped suddenly. You've seen Stanton? The president asked. Yes. He wouldn't listen. He swore I shouldn't have him. The hazel-gray eyes gazed thoughtfully out the window across the shining river for a moment. I have 2, and you have only 1. It isn't fair. You shall have your boy. He turned to his desk and wrote the order for his discharge. The mother pressed close, gently touching with the tips of her fingers thick black hair, and softly cried while he was writing. She took the precious paper, tried to speak, and choked. Go away now, the president whispered. You'll have me crying in a minute. When the last man had gone, he stood alone before his window in brooding silence. A tender smile overspread his face, and he drew a deep breath. In the hills of Pennsylvania he saw a picture, a mother in the door of a humble home waiting for a boy. He is coming down the road with swift, strong steps. She sees and rushes to meet him with a cry of joy, holds him in her arms without words, a long, long while, and will not let him go. And she leads him into the house, falls on her knees, and thanks God. He smiles again and then forgets the burdens of the day. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 18, Diplomacy. In the whirlwind of passion, intrigue, slander, and hate which had circled the head of the new president since the day of his inauguration, the mother of his children had not been spared. The first lady of the land had found her position as difficult in its way as her husband had found his. She had met the cynical criticism, at first with dignity, reserve, and contempt. But as it increased in violence and virulence, she had more than once lost her temper. She had never been blessed with the serenity of spirit that, with Lincoln in his trying hours, touched the heights of genius. She was just a human little woman who loved her husband devotedly and hated every man and woman who hated him. And when her patience was exhausted, she said things as she thought them, with a contempt for the consequences as sublime as it was dangerous. From the moment of the opening of the war, she hated the South, not only because the Southern people had flung the shadow of death over her splendid social career and blighted the brightest dream of her life by war, but she had a more intimate and personal reason for this hatred. Her own flesh and blood had gone into the struggle against her and the husband she loved. Both of her brothers, born in the South, were in the Confederate Army fighting to tear the house down over her head. One of these brothers had been made the commandant of Libby Prison in Richmond. The woman in her could never forgive him. And yet men in the North who sought the destruction of her husband saw how they might use the fact of her Southern kin to their own gain, and did it with the most cruel and bitter malignity. One thing she was determined to do, maintain her position in a way to put it beyond the reach of petty spite and gossip. She had always resented the imputation of boorishness and lack of culture his enemies had made against the man she loved. She held it her first duty, therefore, to maintain her place as the First Lady of the land in a way that would still those slanderous tongues. For this reason, her dresses had been the most elaborate and expensive the wife of any chief magistrate of the Republic had ever worn. Her big-hearted, careless husband had no more idea of the cost of such things than a newborn babe. Lizzie Garland, the Negro dressmaker to whom she had given her patronage, practically spent her entire time with the president's wife, who finally became so contemptuous of unreasonable public criticism in Washington that she was often seen going to Lizzie Garland's house to be fitted. As Lizzie bent over her work, basting the new seams and fitting her last dress, the mistress of the White House suddenly stopped the nervous movement of her rocking chair. "He demands $1,000 tonight, Lizzie? Swears he'll take the whole account to the president tomorrow, unless he gets it, madam. You tried to make him reasonable? Begged him for an hour, miss. That's what I get for trading with a little rat in Philadelphia. I'll stick to Stuart hereafter." She rose with a gesture of nervous rage. "Well, there's no help for it then. I must ask him, and I dread it. Mr. Lincoln calls me a child, a spoiled child. He's the child. He has no idea of what these things cost. Why can't a nation that spends $2 million a day on contractors and soldiers give its president a salary he can live on?" She threw herself on the lounge and gave way for a moment to despair. "He'll give it to you, of course, when you ax it," Lizzie ventured cheerfully. "If I'm diplomatic, yes, but I hate to do it. He's harassed enough. I wonder sometimes if he's human to stand all he does. If he knew the truth, oh my God." "Don't worry, madam," Lizzie pleaded. "He'll come out all right. President's sure to be reelected." "That's it, is he? I'm beginning to lose faith. He'll never win if the scoundrels in Washington can prevent it. There's just one man in Congress that's his real friend. I can't make him see that the hypocrites he keeps in his cabinet are waiting and watching to stab him in the back. But what's the use to talk? I've got to face it today. Ask Phoebe to come here." "Let me go, madam," Lizzie begged. "I hate the sight of that woman. I suspect her of nosing into our affairs." "Nonsense," was the contemptuous answer. "Phoebe's just a big, fat, black, good-natured fool. It rests me to look at her. She's so much fatter than I am." With a shrug of her shoulders, the dressmaker rose and rang for the colored maid who had just entered Mrs. Lincoln's service. Phoebe walked in with a glorious smile lighting her dusky face. Seeing her mistress lying down at the unusual hour of 11 o'clock in the morning, she rushed to her side. "Laws a mercy, ma'am, ain't you well?" "Just a little spell of nerves, Phoebe. Something that never worries your happy soul." "No, ma'am, that they don't." The black woman laughed. "Hand me a pencil and a pad of paper." Phoebe executed her orders with a quick, heavy tread and stood looking while her mistress scribbled a note to her husband. "Take that to the president and see that he comes." "Yes'm, I fetch him." The Honorable Salmon P. Chase, Secretary of the Treasury, was engaged with the president when Phoebe presented herself at the door of the executive office. John Hay tried in vain to persuade her to wait a few minutes. Phoebe brushed the young diplomat aside with scant ceremony. "Wait from here, boy," she laughed. "Miss Mary sent me to fetch him right away, and I'm going to fetch him." She threw her ponderous form straight through the door and made for the chief magistrate. Mr. Chase was delivering an important argument, but it had no weight with her. Phoebe bowed and curtsied to the president. "Excuse me, Governor," he said with a smile. "Good morning, Phoebe." "Good morning, sir." She extended the note with a second dip of her ponderous own. "Yes, sir. Miss Mary done said this here communication, you, sir." "You don't say so," the president cried, breaking into a laugh. "Yes, sir." "Then I'm excommunicated, Governor." He nodded to Chase. "I must read the edict." He adjusted his glasses and glanced at the note. "Your mistress is lying down?" "Yes, sir. She's suffering from a spell of nervous prosperity. Yeah, that's all, sir." "Oh, that's all?" "Yes, sir." The president roared with laughter, in which Phoebe joined. "Thank you, Phoebe. Tell her I'll be in there in a minute." "Yes, sir." "And Phoebe," the maid turned as she neared the door. "Yes, sir." "I hope you'll always bring my messages from your mistress." "Yes, sir. I like you, Phoebe. You're cheerful." "I tries to be, sir." She laughed, swinging herself through the door. The president threw his big hands behind his head, leaned back, and laughed until his giant frame shook. The dignified and solemn Secretary of the Treasury scowled, rose, and stalked from the room. "Sorry I couldn't talk any longer, Chase." "It's all right," the Secretary replied with a wave of his hand. The president found his wife alone. "I hope nothing serious, Mother," he said tenderly. "I've a miserable headache again. Why were you so long?" "I was with Governor Chase." "And what did that old snake in the grass want this time?" The president glanced towards the door, uneasily sat down by her side, and touched her hand. "You should be more careful, Mother. Servants shouldn't hear you say things like that." The full lips came together with bitter firmness. "I'll say just what I think when I'm talking to you, Father. What did he want?" "He offered his resignation to me as my Secretary of the Treasury." His wife sprang up with flashing eyes. "And you?" "Refused to accept it." "Oh, my Lord, you're too good and simple for this world. You're a babe in the woods with these wolves prowling after you from every tree, and you won't see them. You know that he's a candidate against you for the presidency, don't you?" "Yes." "You know that he never loses an opportunity to sneer at you behind your back." "I've heard so." "You know that he's hand in glove with the conspirators in Congress who are trying to pull you down." "Perhaps." "You know that he's the greatest letter writer of the age, that he writes as many letters to your generals in the field as old Winter, that he writes to every editor that he knows and every politician he can influence, and that the purpose of these letters is always the same, to pull you down." "Possibly." "You have this chance to put your foot on this frozen snake's head, and yet you bring him into your house again to warm him into life." "Chase is a great Secretary of the Treasury, my dear. The country needs him. I can't afford to take any chances just now of a change for the worse." "He has no idea of leaving. He's only playing a game with you to strengthen himself. Can't you see this?" "Maybe." "And yet you submit to such infamy in your own cabinet." "It's not a crime, Mother, to aspire to high office. The bee's in poor Chase's bonnet. He can't help it. I felt the thing tickle myself. If he can beat me, let the best man win." Don't say such fool things," his wife cried. "I'll scream. You need a guardian. You have 3 men in your cabinet who are using their positions to climb into the presidency over you. Old Seward, Chase, and now Stanton. And you smile and let them think you don't know. You'll never have a united and powerful administration unless you kick those scoundrels out. Mother, you mustn't." "I will. I'll tell you the truth. Nobody else does. I'll tell you to kick those scoundrels out and put your loyal men in their places who will loyally support you and your policies." "I've no right in such an hour to think even of my own ambitions, my dear," was the even, quiet answer. "Seward's the best man for this place I know in the country. Stanton is making the most efficient war secretary we've ever had, and Chase is a great manager of our treasury. I'm afraid to risk a new man. If these men can win over me by rendering their country a greater service than I can, they ought to win. Can't you see, you big baby, that It isn't the man who really gives the greatest service that may win. It's the liar and hypocrite undermining his chief who may win. Won't you have common sense and send these men about their business? Surely you won't lose this chance to get rid of Chase. Won't you accept his resignation? No. There was a moment's tense silence. The wife looked up appealingly, and the rugged hand touched hers gently. I think, Father, you are the most headstrong man that God ever made. The dark, wistful face brightened. And yet they say I'm a good-natured, easy-going fellow with no convictions. They don't know you. Sorry, Mother. We don't see it the same way, but one of us has to decide these things, and I suppose I'm the one. I suppose so. But tell me, he cried cheerfully, what can I do right now to make you happy? You sent for me for something. You didn't know that Chase was there, did you? She hesitated and answered cautiously. It doesn't matter whether I did or not. You refuse to listen to my advice. He bent nearer in evident distress. What can I do, Mother? I need some money. Since Willie's death last winter, I've thought of nothing of my dresses for the next season. I must begin to attend to them. I need $1,000. Today? Yes. He looked at her with a twinkle playing around the corner of his eyes as he slowly rose. Send Phoebe for the check. Ring for her, please. He pulled the old-fashioned red cord vigorously, walked back into the lounge, put his hand in his pockets, and looked at his wife in a comical way. Mother, he said at last, you're a very subtle woman. You'd make a great diplomat if you didn't talk quite so much. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Southerner, A Romance with a Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 19, The Rebel. While Betty Winter was still brooding in angry resentment over the problem of John Vaughan's guilt in sharing the treason of his chief, the army was suddenly swung into the field to contest Lee's invasion of Maryland. The daring venture of the Confederate leader had developed with startling rapidity. The president was elated over the probable annihilation of Lee's army. He knew that half of them were practically barefooted and in rags. He also knew that McClellan outnumbered Lee and Jackson 2-1, and that the Southerners, no longer on the defensive, but aggressors, would be at an enormous disadvantage in Maryland territory. That Lee was walking into a death trap, he was morally sure. The Confederate leader was not blind to the dangers of his undertaking. Conditions in the South practically forced the step. It was of the utmost importance that he should have full and accurate information before his move, and a group of the coolest and bravest young men in his army were called upon to go into Washington as scouts and spies and bring the report. Men who knew the city were needed. Among the 10 selected for the important mission was Ned Vaughn. He had been promoted for gallantry on the field at Malvern Hill and wore the stripes of a lieutenant. He begged for the privilege of risking his life in this work, and his colonel could not deny him. He had proven on 2 occasions his skill on secret work as a scout before the Second Battle of Bull Run. His wide circle of friends in Washington and the utter change in his personal appearance by the growth of a beard made his chances of success the best of any man in the group. He was anxious to render his country the greatest possible service in such a crisis, but there was another motive of his resistless power. He was mad to see Betty Winter. He knew her too well to believe that if he took his life in his hands to look into her eyes, she could betray him. His disguise in the uniform of a federal captain was perfect. His forged past beyond suspicion. He passed the lines of the Union Army unchallenged and spent his first night in Washington in Joe Hall's famous gambling saloon on Pennsylvania Avenue. He arrived too late to make any attempt to see Betty. He stood for half an hour on the corner of the street, gazing with wistful eyes at the light of her window. He dared not call and involve her in the possibility of suspicion. He must wait with caution until she left the house and he could speak to her without being recognized. If he failed to get this chance, he would write her as a last resort. In Hall's place, he found scores of congressmen and men from every department of the government service. Old Thaddeus Stevens, the leader of the war party in the House, was playing for heavy stakes, his sullen, hard face set with grim determination. He watched a young clerk from the War Department stake his last dollar, lose, and stagger from the table with a haunted, desperate look. Ned followed him into 2 saloons and saw the bartenders refuse him credit. He walked through the door of the last saloon, legs trembling and his white lips twitching, stopped and leaned against the wall of the little bookstore on the corner, the flickering street lamp showing dimly his ghastly face and eyes. Ned glanced uneasily behind him to see that he had not been followed. He had left under the impression that a Secret Service man had seen them both leave. He knew that Baker, the head of the department, might know the name of every clerk who frequented a gambling den. No one was in sight, and he debated for a moment the problem of offering this boy a bribe to get from Stanton's office the information he wanted. It was a question of character and his judgment. Could he speak the words to this boy that might send one or both to the gallows? He was well born. His father was a man of sterling integrity and a firm supporter of the Union. The boy was 22 years old and had been a pet in the fast circles of society for which he had moved for the last 3 years. If his love was for his country, he would hand Ned over as a spy without a moment's hesitation. If the mania for gambling had done its work, he would do anything for money. Ned's own life was in the decision. He took another look into the haggard face and made up his mind. He started on, as if to pass him, suddenly stopped and extended his hand. "Hello, Dick, what's up?" The boy glowered at him and answered with a snarl. "I don't know you." Ned drew a sigh of relief. One danger was past. He couldn't recognize him. The rest should be easy. "You don't need to, my boy. You're looking for a friend. Money?" "Yes." "I'll sell my soul into hell for it right now," he gasped. "You don't need to do that." Ned drew $200 in gold from his pocket and clinked the coin. "You see that gold?" Yes. What do you want for it?" "I want you to get for me tomorrow morning the exact number of men in McClellan's army. I want the figures from Stanton's office, you understand. I want the name of each command, its numbers, and its officers. I already know half of them, so you can't lie to me. Give me this information here tomorrow night and the gold's yours. Will you do it?" The boy glanced at Ned for a moment. "I'll see you in hell first. I've a notion to arrest you, damned if I don't." He wheeled and started towards the corner. Ned's left hand gripped his with a snap of a steel trap, his right holding a revolver. "Don't be a fool. I know that you're ruined. I saw you in Joe Hall's." The boy's jaw dropped. "You saw me?" he stammered. "Yes, you're done for, and you know it. Bring me those figures and I'll double the pile. $400. The weak eyes shifted uneasily. He hesitated and faltered. "All right, meet me here at 7 o'clock. For God's sake, don't speak to me if there's anyone in sight." And all next day, Ned watched Betty's house in vain. At dark, in despair and desperation, he wrote a note. "Dear Miss Betty, for one look into your dear eyes, I am here. I tried in vain to meet you. I can't leave without seeing you. I'll wait in the park at the foot of the avenue tomorrow night at dusk. Just one touch of your hand and 5 minutes near you is all that I ask." There was no signature needed. She would know. He mailed it and hurried to his appointment. The boy was prompt. There was no one in sight. Ned hurriedly examined the sheet of paper, verified the known commands and their numbers, and convinced of its genuineness, handed the money to the trader. "For God's sake, never speak to me again or recognize me in any way," he begged through chattering teeth. "I got those things from Stanton's desk and copied them." Ned nodded, placed the precious document in his pocket, and watched the fool hurry with swift feet straight to Joe Hall's place and disappear within. Betty failed to come at the appointed time, and he was heartsick. He would finish his work in 6 hours tomorrow and should not lose a moment in passing the federal lines. The precious figures he had bought were memorized and the paper destroyed. In 6 hours next day, he completed the drawings of the fort on which information had been asked and was ready to leave. But he had not seen Betty. He tried to go, and each effort only led him to the corner from which he watched her house. He lingered until night and waited an hour again in the park, and still she had not come. And then it slowly dawned on him that she must have realized from the moment she read his message the peril of his position and the danger of his betrayal in their meeting. He turned with a quick, firm tread to pass the federal lines without delay and walked into the arms of 2 Secret Service men. Without a word, he was manacled and led to prison. The boy he had bribed had been under suspicion since his first visit to Joe Hall's. Stanton had discovered that his desk had been rummaged. 5 of his 9 Southern comrades had been arrested, and he was the 6th. The rage of the Secretary of War had been boundless. He had thrown out a dragnet of detectives, and every suspicious character in the city was passing through it or landing in prison. The men stripped him and searched him with the touch of an expert's every stitch of his clothing, ripped the lining of his coat, opened the soles of his shoes, split the heels, and found nothing. He had been ordered to dress and given permission to go when suddenly the officer conducting the search said, "Wait." Ned stopped in the doorway. It was useless to protest. "Excuse my persistence, my friend," he said apologetically. "You seem all right, and my men must apparently made a mistake. All the same, I'm going to examine your mouth." Ned's eyes suddenly flashed and his figure unconsciously stiffened. "I thought so," the officer laughed. The door was closed and the guard stepped before it. And then, with quick, sure touch, as if he saw the object of his search through the flesh, the detective lifted Ned Vaughn's upper lip and drew from between his lips and teeth the long, thin, delicately folded tinfoil within which lay the tissue drawing of the fort. The drumhead court-martial which followed was brief and formal. The prisoner refused to give his name or any clue to his identity. He was condemned to be hanged as a spy at noon the next day and locked in a cell of the old Capitol prison. On his way, they passed Senator Winter's house. 6 hours' delay just to look at her face had cost him his life, but one hopeless regret now was that he had failed to see her. Betty Winter read the account of the sensational arrest and death sentence. He had been arrested at the trysting place he had appointed. She dropped the paper with a cry and hurried to the White House. She thanked God for the loving heart that dwelt there. Without a moment's hesitation, the president ordered a suspension of his sentence and directed that the papers be sent to him for review. In vain Stanton raged. He shook his fist in the calm, rugged face at last. "Dare to interfere with the final execution of this sentence, and I shall resign in 5 minutes after you issue that pardon. I'll stand for some things, but not for this. I warn you." "I understand your position, Stanton," was the quiet answer, "and I'll let you know my decision when I've reached it." With a muttered oath, the Secretary of War left the room. Betty bent close to his desk and whispered, "You'll give me 3 days to get his mother here?" "Of course I will, child. 6 days if necessary. Get word to her. If I can't save him, she can at least say goodbye to her boy. That can't hurt anybody, can it?" With a warm grasp of his hand, Betty flew to the telegraph office, and 3 days later she saw for the first time the broken-hearted mother. The resemblance was so startling between the mother and both sons she couldn't resist the impulse to throw her arms around her neck. "I came alone, dear," the mother said brokenly, "because his father is so bitter. You see, we're divided at home, too. I'm with John in his love for the Union, but his father is bitter against the war. It would do no good for him to come. He hates the president and says he's responsible for all the blood and suffering. So I'm alone. But you'll help me?" "Yes, I'll help you, and we'll fight to win." The mother held her at arm's length a moment. "How sweet and beautiful you are. How happy I am that you love my John. I'm proud of you. Is John here?" Betty's face clouded. "No. I telegraphed him to come. He answered that a great battle was about to be fought and that it was absolutely useless to ask for a pardon." "But it isn't, is it, dear? No, we'll fight. John doesn't know the president as I do. We'll never give up, you and I, Mother." Again they were in each other's arms in silence. The older woman held her close, and then came the long, hard fight. The president heard the mother's pleas with tender patience, shook his head sorrowfully. "I'm sorry, dear madam, to find this case so difficult and dangerous. Our army's approaching a battle. Tremendous issues hang on the results. It looks now as if this battle may end the war. The enemy have as good a right to send their brave scouts and spies among us to learn our secrets as we have to send ours to learn theirs. They've killed our boys without mercy when captured. I have just asked Jefferson Davis to spare the life of one of our noblest and bravest men I ever know. He was caught in Richmond on a daring errand for his country. They refused and executed him. How can I face my Secretary of War with such a pardon in my hands?" The mother's head drooped lower with each sorrowful word, and when the voice ceased she fell on her knees with clasped hands and streaming eyes, in a voiceless prayer whose dumb agony found the president's heart more swiftly and terribly with words. "Oh, my dear little mother, you mustn't do that," he protested, seizing her hand and lifting her to his feet. "You mustn't kneel to me. I'm not your God. I'm just a distracted man praying from hour to hour and day to day for wisdom to do what's right. I can't stand this. You mustn't do such things. They'll kill me." He threw his big hands into the air with a gesture of despair, his face corpse-like in its ashen agony. He took a step from her and leaned against the long table in the center of the room for support. Betty whispered something in the mother's ear and led her near again. "If you'll just give my boy to me alive," she wept in low anguish, I'll take him home and keep him there, and I'll pledge my life that he will never again take up arms against the Union." "You can guarantee me that?" he interrupted, holding her gaze. "I'm sure of it. He's noble, high-spirited, the soul of honor. He was always good and never gave me an hour's sorrow in his life until this war came." The long arm suddenly swung toward his secretary. "Have the prisoner Ned Vaughn brought here immediately. When he comes, madam, I'll see what can be done." With a sob of joy, the mother leaned against Betty, who took her out into the air until the wagon from the jail should come. They had led Ned quickly into the president's office before the mother and Betty knew of his arrival. His wrists were circled with handcuffs. The president looked over his spectacles at the irons and spoke sharply. "Take those things off him." The guard hesitated, and a high-pitched voice rang with angry authority. "Take those handcuffs off, I tell you. His mother will be here in a minute. Take 'em off." The guard quickly removed the manacles, and the president turned to him and his attendants. "Clear out now. I'll call you when I want you." Ned bowed. "Thank you, sir." "I hope I can do more than that for you, my boy. It all depends on you." The mother's cry of joy stopped short as she walked into the office. With a bound, she reached Ned's side, clasped him in her arms, and kissed him again and again with the low, caressing words that only a mother's lips can breathe. He loosened her hands tenderly. "I'm glad you came. It's all right. You mustn't worry. This is war, you know. But we're going to save you, my darling. The president's going to pardon you. I feel it. I know it. That's why he sent for you. God has heard my prayer." "I'm afraid you don't understand these things, dear," Ned replied tenderly. "The president can't pardon me. No one understands that better than I do. But he will, darling, he will." Ned soothed her and turned to Betty. "Just a moment, Mother. I wish to speak to Miss Betty." He took her hand and looked into her face with wistful intensity. "One long look at the girl of my dreams, and I'll wait for you on the other side. This is not the way I told you I would return, is it? But it's war. We must take it as it comes. Goodbye, dearest." "Oh, Ned, boy, the president will pardon you if you'll be reasonable. You must, for her sake, if not because I ask it. It's sweet of you to try this, dearest, but of course it's useless. The president must be just." The tall figure rose, and Ned turned to face his desk. "Young man," he began gently, "you're a soldier of exceptional training and intelligence. You knew the danger and importance of your mission. You have failed, and your life is forfeited to the nation. But for your mother's sake, because of her love and her anguish and her loyalty, I've decided to trust you and send you home on parole in her custody if you take the oath of allegiance." The mother gave a sob of joy. "I thank you, Mr. President," was the firm reply, "for your generous offer for my mother's sake, but I can't take your oath. I have sworn allegiance to another government, in the righteousness and justice of whose cause I live and am ready to die." "Ned, Ned," the mother moaned. "I must, mother dear," he firmly went on. "Life is sweet when it's worth living, but man cannot live by bread alone. They have only the power to kill my body. You asked me to murder my soul." He paused and turned to the president, whose eyes were shining with admiration. "I believe, sir, that I am right and you are wrong. This is war. We must fight it out. I'm a soldier, and a soldier's business is to die." The tall figure crossed the space that separated them and grasped his hands. "You're a brave man, Ned Vaughn, the kind of man that saves this world from hell, the kind that makes this nation great and worth saving whole. I wish I could keep you here, but I can't. You know that. Goodbye." "Goodbye, sir," was the firm answer. The mother began to sob piteously until Betty spoke something into her ear. Ned turned, pressed her to his heart, and held in silence. He took Betty's hand and bent to kiss it. "You shall not die," she whispered tensely. "I'm going to save you." She felt the answering pressure and knew that he understood. Betty held the mother at the door a moment, spoke in low tones. "I can get permission from the president to delay the execution until his sister might arrive and say goodbye to him in prison the night before the execution. Wait, and I'll get it now." The mother stood and gazed in a stupor of dull despair while Betty pressed to his desk and begged the last favor. It was granted without hesitation. The president wrote the order delaying the death for 3 days and handed her his card, on which it was written, "Admit the bearer, the sister of the prisoner, Ned Vaughn, the night before his execution, to see him for 5 minutes. Abraham Lincoln." "I'm sorry, little girl, I couldn't do more for your sake, but you understand." Betty nodded, returned the pressure of his hand, and hurriedly left the room. The hanging was fixed for the following Friday at noon. The pass would admit his sister on Thursday night. Betty had 3 days which to do her work. She drew every dollar of her money and went hard at her task, swiftly, silently, surely, until she reached the guard inside the grim old prison, which held the keys to the death watch. She couldn't trust the sister with her daring plan. She might lose her nerve. She must impersonate her. It was a dangerous piece of work, but it was not impossible. She had only to pass the inspectors. The guards inside were friends. On Thursday night at 8 o'clock, a carriage drew up at the little red brick house on whose door flashed the brass plate sign, Elizabeth Garland, modiste. She had made an appointment with Mrs. Lincoln's dressmaker and arranged for it at this late hour. She must not be seen leaving her father's house tonight. She drove rapidly to the Capitol, stopping her carriage at the north end, entered the building through the Senate wing, quickly passed out again, and in a few minutes had presented her pass to the commandant of the old Capitol prison. The woman inspector made the most thorough search and finding nothing, allowed her to enter the dimly lighted corridor of the death watch. The turnkey loudly announced, "The sister of the prisoner, Ned Vaughn." She met him face to face in a large cell which the condemned were allowed to pass their last night on earth. The keen eyes of the guard from the inspector's office watched her every act and every movement of her body. Ned stared at her. His heart beat with mad joy. She was going to play his sister's part. He would take her in his arms for the first time and feel the beat of her heart against his, and their lips would meet. He laughed at death as he looked into her eyes with the hunger of eternity gleaming in his own. There could be no hesitation on her part. She threw both arms around his neck, crying, "Brave, foolish boy!" He held her close, crushed her with one mad impulse, and slowly relaxed his arms. She would forgive him for this moment of delirium on the brink of the grave, but he must be reasonable. "I am ready to die now, dearest," he murmured. She slowly lifted her lips to his in a long kiss, a kiss that thrilled body and soul, and pressed into his mouth a tiny piece of tissue paper. She stood, holding both his hands for a moment, and hesitated, glancing at the guard from the corner of her eye. He was watching with steady, stolid, businesslike stare. She must play her part to the end, carefully and boldly. "I've only this moment just to say goodbye, boy," she faltered. "I promise not to stay long." Slowly her arms stole round his neck, and the blood rushed to his face in scarlet waves. "Love has made death glorious, dearest," he breathed tenderly. "God bless you for your coming, for all you've done for me, and for this holy hour, what it means to my soul. You understand." The tears were streaming down her cheeks now. The plan just might fail after all. The gallows were there in the jail yard, lifting its stark arms and lowering sky. She pressed his hands hysterically. "Yes, yes, I understand." She turned and hurried to the guard. "Take me out quickly. I'm going to faint. I can't endure it." The guard caught her arm, supporting her as he made her way to the street. In 15 minutes she had returned to her dressmaker's, and from there called another carriage and went home. The guard had no sooner turned his back than Ned Vaughn quickly opened and read the precious message which gave the plan of escape. When the sentinel on his corridor was changed at midnight, the blond, blue-eyed boy would be his friend and explain. When he found the rope ladder concealed on the roof, it was raining. He fastened it carefully in the shadow of an offset in the outer wall and waited for the appearance of the guard. As he passed the gas lamp post and the flickering light fell on his face, he studied it with care. He was stupid, and allowed the rain to dash straight into his fat face. It should be easy to reach the shadows by a quick leap. When he turned against the rain and reached the length of his beat, he calculated to a second the time required to make the descent, threw himself swiftly into the end of his rope, and dropped to the pavement. In his eagerness to strike the ground on the run, his foot slipped and he fell. The guard heard and ran back, blinking his stupid eyes through the rain. He found a young sport who had lost his way in the storm. "I shay, partner," the fallen drunk blubbered. "What hell's the matter here? Ain't that Joe Hall's place?" "Not by a damn sight." "Go along with your foolishness, man, and open the door." "I'm an old customer. I ain't no Secret Service man." "I'm all right. Open her up." Here. Get up and move on now. I can't fool with you," the guard growled good-naturedly. He lifted Ned to his feet and helped him to the end of his beat, waved him a jolly good night, and turned to his steady tramp. The rope was still dangling next morning 10 feet above his head. The sensation that thrilled the War Department was one that made history for the nation, as well as the individuals concerned, and for some, unfortunately, who were not concerned. End of Chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 20, The Insult. The day General Lee's army turned toward the north for the Maryland shore, the President, with the eagerness of a boy, hurried to General McClellan's house to shake his hand, bid him Godspeed, and assure him of his earnest support and good wishes. The absurdity of the ruler of a mighty nation hurrying on foot to the house of one of his generals never occurred to his mind. The autocratic power over the lives and future of millions to which he had been called had thrown no shadow of vanity or self-pride over his simple life. Responsibility had only made clearer his judgment, strengthened his courage, broadened and deepened his love for his fellow man. He wished to see his commanding general and bid him Godspeed. The general was busy, and he wished to take up but a few minutes of his time, and so without a moment's hesitation he walked to his house, accompanied only by Hay, his assistant secretary. On the way he was jubilant with hope. "We've got 'em now, boy, we've got 'em, and this war must speedily end. Lee will never get into Maryland with 50,000 effective men. With the river hemming him in on the rear, I'll have McClellan on him with 100,000 well-shod, well-fed, well-armed, and with the finest artillery that ever thundered into battle. We're bound to win." "If McClellan can whip him, sir?" "Yeah, of course. He's got to do that," was the thoughtful answer. "And you know I believe he'll do it. McClellan's on his mettle now. His army will fight like tigers to show their faith in him. He's vain and ambitious, yes, many great men are. Ambition's a mighty human motive." "I'm afraid it's bad diplomacy, sir, to go to his house like this. He's vain, you know," the younger man observed with a frown. "Tut, tut, boy. It's no time for ceremony. Who cares a copper?" The clock in the church tower struck 10 as Hay sprang up the steps and rang the bell. "I hope he hasn't gone to bed," the secretary said. 10 o'clock? The president laughed. "A great general about to march on the most important campaign of his life? Hardly." The straight orderly saluted and ushered them into the elegant reception room, the room so often graced by the Prince de Joinville and the Comte de Paris of the general's staff. The orderly sniffed the air in a superior butler style. "The general has not come in yet, gentlemen." "We'll wait," was the president's response. They sat in silence. The minute dragged. The young secretary, in rising wrath, looked again and again at the clock. "Don't be so impatient, John," the quiet, even voice said. "Great bodies move slowly, they say. Come here and sit down. I'll tell you a secret. The cabinet knows it, and you can too." He leaned his giant figure forward in the chair and touched an official document which he had drawn from his pocket. "Great events hang on this battle. I've written out here a challenge to the mortal combat for all of our foes, north, south, east, and west. I'm going to free the slaves if we win this battle, and we're sure to win it." Hay glanced at the door with a startled look. "McClellan and I don't agree on this subject, and he mightn't fight as well if he knew it. It's a thing of doubtful wisdom at its best to hurl this challenge into the face of my foe, but the time has come, and it must be done. We have made no headway in this war, and we must crush the South to end it. If the Copperhead leaders should get control of the Democratic Party because of it, well, it means trouble at home. Douglas is dead, and the jackal is trying to wear the lion's skin. He may succeed, but then I must risk it. I'll lose some good soldiers from the army, but I've got to do it. All I'm waiting for now is a victory on which to launch my thunderbolt." A key clicked in the front door, and the quick, firm step of McClellan echoed through the hall. The orderly was reporting his distinguished visitor. They could hear low words in the sharp answer. The general mounted the stairs and entered the front room overhead. He was there, of course, to arrange his toilet. He was a stickler for handsome clothes, spotless linen, and the last detail of ceremony. Again the minutes dragged. The tick of the clock on the mantel rang through the silent room, and the face of the younger man grew red with rage. Unable to endure the insolence of a subordinate toward the great chieftain, whom he loved with a boy's blind devotion, Hay sprang to his feet. Let's go, sir. The big hand was quietly raised in a gesture of command, and he sank into his seat. 5 minutes more passed, and the sound of approaching footsteps were heard quickly, firmly pressed with military precision. The president nodded. "You see, my son." But instead of the general, the handsome figure of his aide, John Vaughan, appeared in the doorway. "The general begs me to say, Mr. President, that he is much too fatigued to see anyone this evening and has retired for the night." The orderly stepped pompously to the door to usher them out, and John Vaughan bowed and returned to his commander. Hay sprang to his feet, livid with rage, and spoke to his chief with boyish indignation. "You're not going to take this insult from him." The tall figure slowly rose and stood in silence. "Remove him from his command," the younger man pleaded. "For God's sake, do it now. Write the order for his removal this minute. Give it to me. I'll kick his door open and hand it to him." The deep-set, dreamy eyes were turned within as he said in a slow, intense tone, "No, I'll hold McClellan's horse for him if he'll just give us one victory." End of Chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 21, The Bloodiest Day. The struggle opened with disaster for the Union Army. Though Lee's plan of campaign fell by accident into McClellan's hands, it was too late to frustrate the first master stroke. Relying on Jackson's swift, bewildering marches, Lee, in hostile territory and confronted by twice his number, suddenly divided his army and hurled Jackson's corps against Harper's Ferry. The garrison, after a futile struggle of 2 days, surrendered 12,520 men and their vast stores of war material. The contrast between General White, the Federal officer in command who surrendered, and Jackson, his conqueror, was strikingly dramatic. The Union general rode a magnificent black horse, was carefully dressed in a shining immaculate uniform, gloves, boots, and sword spotless. The Confederate general sat carelessly on a little shaggy sorrel, dusty, travel-stained, and carelessly dressed. The curiosity of the Union army, which had surrendered, was keen to see the famous fighter. The entire 12,000 prisoners of war lined the road as Jackson silently rode by. A voice from the crowd expressed the universal feeling as they gazed. "Boys, he ain't much for looks, but by God, if we'd had him, we wouldn't have been caught in this trap." The first shock of Lee and McClellan's armies was at South Mountain, where the desperate effort was made to break through and save Harper's Ferry. The attempt failed, though the Union forces won the fight. Lee lost 2,700 men, killed and wounded and prisoners, and the Federal general 2,100. Lee withdrew to Sharpsburg on the banks of the Antietam to meet Jackson's victorious division sweeping toward him from Harper's Ferry. On the first day, the Confederate commander made a display of force only, awaiting the alignment of Jackson's troops. His men were so poorly shod and clothed that they could not be brought into a line of battle. When the fateful day of September 17th, 1862 dawned still and clear and beautiful over the hills of Maryland, more than 20,000 of Lee's men had fallen by the roadside barefooted and exhausted. When the first roar of McClellan's artillery opened fire in the gray dawn, they hurled their shells against less than 37,000 men in the Confederate lines. The Union commander had massed 87,000 tried veterans behind the guns. The president received the first news of the battle with a thrill of exultation. That Lee's ragged, footsore army hemmed in, thus with Antietam Creek on one side and the broad, sweeping Potomac on the other, that Lee's army would be crushed and destroyed, he could not doubt for a moment. As the sun rose above the eastern hills, a gleaming, dull red ball of blood, the Federal infantry, under Hooker, swept into action and drove the Confederates from the open field into a dense woods, where they rallied, stood, and mowed his men down with deadly aim. Hooker called for aid, and General Mansfield rushed his corps into action, falling dead at the head of his men as they deployed in the line of battle. For 2 hours the sullen conflict raged, blue and gray lines surging in death-locked embrace until the field was strewn with the dead, the dying, and the wounded. Hooker was wounded. Sedgwick's corps swept into the field under a sharp artillery fire and reached the shelter of the woods, only to find themselves caught in a trap between the two Confederate brigades massed at this point. In the slaughter which followed, Sedgwick was wounded, and his command was saved from annihilation with the loss of 2,000 men. While this desperate struggle raged in the Union right, the center was the scene of a still bloodier one. French and Richardson charged the Confederate position with reckless valor. A sunken road lay across the field which they rushed. For 4 terrible hours the men in gray held this sunken road until it was piled with their bodies, and when the last charge of the resistless blue lines took it, they found but 300 living men who had been holding it against the assault of 5,000, and Bloody Lane became immortal in American history. It was now 1 o'clock, and the men had fought almost continuously since the sun rose. The infantry fire slowly slackened and ceased in the Union right and center. Burnside, who held the Union left, was ordered to advance by the capture of the stone bridge over the Antietam. But a single brigade under General Toombs guarding this bridge held an army at bay, and it was 1 o'clock before the bridge was captured. Burnside now pushed his division up the heights against Sharpsburg to cut off Lee's line of retreat. The Confederates held their ground with desperate courage, though outnumbered here 3-1. At last the gray lines melted, and the men in blue swept triumphantly through the village, and on its edge suddenly ran into a line of men clad in their own blue uniforms. They paused in wonder. How had their own men gotten in such a position? They were not left long in doubt. The blue line suddenly blazed with long red waves of flames squarely at their faces. It was Hill's division of Jackson's Corps from Harper's Ferry. The ragged men had dressed themselves in good blue suits from the captured Federal storehouse. The shock threw the Union men into confusion. With a desperate charge of the strange blue Confederates, drove them back through the village, and night fell with the streets still held by Lee's army. For 14 hours, 500 pieces of artillery and more than 100,000 muskets had thundered and hissed their cries of death. On the hill and valley lay more than 20,000 men killed and wounded. Lee's little army of 37,000 had been cut to pieces, having lost 14,000. He had but 23,000 left. McClellan had lost 12,000, but had 75,000 left. And yet so desperate had been the deadly courage which the gray tattered army had fought that McClellan lay on his arms for 3 days. The day's work had been a drawn battle, but the president's heart was broken as he watched in anguish at the withdrawal of Lee's army into safety across the Potomac River. It was the last straw. McClellan had been weighed and found wanting. He registered a solemn promise with God that if the great Confederate commanders succeeded in making good their retreat from the desperate situation, he would remove McClellan. The Confederates withdrew, rallied their shattered forces in Virginia, and Jeb Stuart once more rode around the Northern Army. The President issued his Emancipation Proclamation challenging the South to war to the death, and flung down the gauntlet to his rival, the coming leader of the Northern democracy, George Brinton McClellan, by removing him from command. End of Chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Southerner, by A Romance of the Real Lincoln, by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 22, Beneath the Skin. John Vaughan saw the blow fall on McClellan's magnificent headquarters in deep amazement. The idol of the army was ordered to turn over his command to General Burnside, and the impossible had happened. Instead of the brilliant coup d'etat which he and the entire staff had predicted, the fallen leader obeyed and took an affectionate leave of his men. McClellan knew what his staff could not understand, that for the moment the president was master of the situation. He still held the unbounded confidence of his officers, but the rank and file of his soldiers had become his wondering critics. They believed they had crushed Lee's army at Antietam, and yet they lay idle until the skillful Southern commander had crossed the Potomac, making good his retreat, and once more insulted them by riding around their entire lines. The volunteer American soldier was a good fighter and a good critic of the men who led him. He had his own ideas about how an army should be fought and maneuvered. As the idol of the fighting men, McClellan had ceased to threaten the supremacy of the civil law. There was no attempt at the long-looked-for coup d'etat. It was too late. No one knew this more clearly than McClellan himself. But his fall was the bitterness of death to the staff who adored him and the generals who believed in him. Burnside, knowing the condition of practical anarchy he must face, declined the command. The president forced him to accept it. He took it reluctantly with grim forebodings of failure. John received his long leave of absence from his chief and left for Washington the night before the formal farewell. His rage against the bungler who ruled the nation with autocratic power was fierce and implacable. His resentment against the woman he loved was scarcely less bitter. It was her triumph, too. She believed in the divine inspiration of the man who sat in the chair of Washington and Jefferson. Great God! Could madness reach sublimer folly? She had written him a letter of good wishes and all, but had asked him for reconciliation before the battle. Love had fought with a pride through a night, and pride had won. He hadn't answered the letter. He avoided his newspaper friends and plunged into a round of dissipation. Beneath the grim tragedy of blood in Washington flowed the ever-widening and deepening torrent of sensual revelry, of wine and women, song and dance, gambling and intrigue. The flash of something cruel in his eye, which Betty Winter had seen and feared from the first, burned now with a steady blaze. For 6 days and nights he played in Joe Hall's place a desperate game, drinking, always and winning. Hour after hour he was seen at the roulette table, his chin sunk on his breast, his reddened eyes gleaming beneath his heavy black brows, silent, surly, and unapproachable. A reporter from the Republican recognized him and extended his hand. "Hello, Vaughn." John stared at him coldly and resumed his play without a word. At the end of 6 days he had won more than $2,000 from the house, put it in his pocket, and deaf to the blandishments of smooth, gentlemanly proprietor, he pushed his way out into the avenue. It was but 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and John was only half drunk. He wandered aimlessly down the street and crossed in the direction of Hell's Half Acre below the Baltimore Depot. His uniform was wrinkled, his boots had not been blacked for a week, his linen was dirty, his hair rumpled, his handsome black mustache stained with drink, but he was hilariously conscious that he had $2,000 of Joe Hall's ill-gotten money in his pocket. There was a devil-may-care swing to his walk and a look in his eye that no decent woman would care to see twice. He ran squarely into Betty Winter in the crowd emerging from the depot. The little bag she was carrying fell from her hand with a cry of startled anguish. "John, my God!" He made no effort to pick up the fallen bag or in any way return the greeting. He merely paused and stared, deliberately stood and stared as if stupefied by the apparition. In fact, he was so startled by her sudden appearance that for a moment he felt the terror of a drunkard's first hallucination. The thought was momentary. He knew better. He wasn't drunk. The girl was there all right, the real thing, living, beautiful, flesh and blood. For 1 second's anguish, the love of her strangled him. The desire to take her in his arms was all but resistless. In its fierce madness, he bit his lips and scowled in her face. John, dearest," she gasped. The scowl darkened, and he spoke with insulting deliberation. "You've made a mistake. I haven't the honor of your acquaintance." Before Betty could recover from the horror of his answer, he had brushed rudely past her and disappeared into the crowd. She picked up her bag in a stupor of dumb rage and started home. She was too weak for the walk she had hoped to take. She called a hack and scarcely had the strength to climb into the high, old-fashioned seat. Never in all of her life had blind anger so possessed her, soul and body. In a moment of tenderness, she had offered to forgive and forget. It was all over now. The brute was not worth a tear of regret. She would show him. 2 weeks later, John Vaughn stared into the ebony face of a Negro who had attached himself to his fortune somewhere in the revelry of the night before. Washington was swarming with these foolish black children who had come in thousands. They had no money, and it had not occurred to them that they would need any. Their food and clothes had always been provided, and they took no thought for the morrow. John had forgotten the fact that he had taken the Negro in his hack for 2 hours and finally adopted him as his own. He sat up, pressed his hand over his aching head, and stared into the grinning face. "And what are you doing here, you imp of the devil?" Julius laughed and rolled his eyes. "I's your man. Don't you mind taking me up into hack with you last night?" "What's your name?" "Julius Caesar, sir." "Then it's all right. You're the man I'm looking for. You're the man this country's looking for. You're a born fighter." "Now, sir, I's a cook." "Shh! Say, not so. We're going to war." "All right, sir. I's going with you." "I warned you, Julius Caesar. Don't do it unless you're in for a fight. I'm going back to fight to kill. No more red tape and gold braid for me. I'm going now into the jaws of hell. I'm going into the ranks as a private." "Don't make no difference to me, sir. What you go, I's going with you. I can look after these shoes and cook you something good to eat. I warn you, Julius, when they find your torn and mangled body on the field of death, don't you sit up and blame me. Don't you worry, sir. They ain't gonna find me there, and if they do, they ain't gonna be nothing told mangled about me. I see to that, sir. 3 weeks later, Burnside's army received a stalwart recruit. Few questions were asked. The ranks were melting. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 23, The Usurper. The answer which the country gave the President's proclamation of emancipation was a startling one, even to the patient, careful, far-seeing man of the people in the White House. For months he had carried the immortal document in his pocket without even allowing his cabinet to know it had been written. He had patiently borne the abuse of his party leaders and the fierce assaults of Horace Greeley until he believed the time had come that he must strike this blow, a blow which would rouse the South to desperation and unite his enemies in the North. He had finally issued it with grave fears. The results were graver than he could foresee. More than once he was compelled to face the issue of its repeal as the only way to forestall a counter-revolution in the North. Desertions from the army became appalling. The number reached frequently as high as 2,000 a day, and the aggregate over 8,000 a month. His proclamation had not provided for the enlistment of Negroes as soldiers. Not only did thousands of men refuse to continue to fight when the issue of slavery was injected, but other thousands felt that the uniform of the Republic had been dishonored by placing it on the backs of slaves. They refused to wear it longer and deserted at the risk of their lives. The proclamation had united the South and hopelessly divided the North. How serious this northern division was destined to become was the problem now of a concern as deep as the size and efficiency of General Lee's army. The election of the new Congress would put his administration to a supreme fight for existence. If the Democratic Party under its new leader, Clay Van Allen of Ohio, should win it, it meant a hostile majority in power whose edicts could end the war and divide the Union. They had already selected in secret George B. McClellan for their coming standard-bearer. For the first time, the question of union or disunion was squarely up to the North in an election, and it came at an unlucky moment, for the President. The army in the West had ceased to win victories. The Southern army under Lee was still defending Richmond as strongly as ever. There was no evading the issue at the polls. The proclamation had committed the President to the bold, far-reaching, radical, and aggressive policy of the utter destruction of slavery. The people were asked to choose between slavery on one hand and nationality on the other. The two together they could not again have. The President had staked his life on his faith that the people could be trusted on the square issue of right and wrong. This time he had underestimated the force of blind passions which the hell of war had raised. Maine voted first and cut down her majority for the administration from 19,000 to a bare 4,000. The facts were ominous. Ohio spoke next, and Van Allen's ticket against the administration swept the state, returning 14 Democrats and only 5 Republicans to Congress. Indiana, the state in which the President's mother slept, spoke in thunder tones against him, sending 8 Democrats and 3 Republicans. Even the rock-ribbed Republican stronghold of Pennsylvania was carried by the opposition by a majority of 4,000, reversing Lincoln's former majority of 60,000. In New York, the brilliant Democratic leader Horatio Seymour was elected governor on the platform hostile to the administration by more than 10,000 majority. New Jersey had turned against him. Michigan reduced his majority from 20 to 6,000. Wisconsin evenly divided its delegates to Congress. Illinois, the President's own state, gave the most crushing blow of all. His big majority there was completely reversed, and the Democrats carried the state by over 17,000, and the congressional delegates stood 11-3 against him. And then his border state policy, against which the leaders of his party had raged in vain, was vindicated in the most startling way. True to his steadfast purpose to hold these states in the Union at all hazards, he had not included them in the Emancipation Proclamation. One of the reasons for which they had refused his offer of United States bonds of payment for their slaves was that they did not believe them worth the paper they were written on. A war costing $2 million a day was sure to bankrupt the nation before the end could be seen, and yet because he had treated them with patience and fairness, with justice and with generosity, The border states and the new state of West Virginia, born of this policy, voted to sustain the president, saved his administration from ruin, and gave him another chance to fight for the life of the Union. It was a close shave. His working majority in Congress was reduced to a narrow margin. The opposition was a large, united, and fierce force in its aggression, but he had been saved from annihilation. The temper of the men elected to the legislatures, both state and national, in the great northern states was astounding. So serious was the situation in Indiana that Governor Morton hastened to Washington to lay the crisis before the president. "I'm sorry to have to tell you," the governor began, "but we must face it. The Democratic politicians of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, now called to power, assume that the rebellion will not be crushed, and therefore that their interests are antagonistic to New England and in harmony with the South. Another 3 months like the last 6, and we are lost, sir, hopelessly lost." "Is it as bad as that, Governor?" the sad, even voice asked. A smile flickered across the stern, fine face of the war governor. "If you think me a pessimist, remember that Van Allen, their leader, has just presided over a Democrat Jubilee meeting in Ohio, which was swept again and again by cheers for Jefferson Davis, curses and jeers for the abolitionists. His speech had been put in the form of a leaflet, which is being mailed in thousands to our soldiers at the front." "You know that to be a fact?" the president asked sharply. "The fact is notorious, sir. It will be disputed by no one. The outlook is black. Meeting after meeting is being held in Indiana demanding peace at any price, with the recognition of the Southern Confederacy, and mark you, what is still more significant is the formation of a Northwestern Confederacy, with the possible capital at your hometown of Springfield, Illinois." "No, no," the president groaned. "Your last call for 300,000 volunteers," the governor went on, "as you well know, was an utter failure. Only 86,000 men have been raised under it. I was compelled to use a draft to secure the number I did in Indiana. It is useless to call for more volunteers anywhere." "Then we'll have to use the draft," was the firm reply. "If we can enforce it," the governor warned. "A meeting has just been held in my state in which resolutions were unanimously passed demanding that the war cease, denouncing the attempt to use power to draft men, declaring that our volunteers had been induced to enter the army under a false declaration, that the war was waged solely to maintain the Constitution and restore the Union." "And so it is," the president interrupted, "until you issued your proclamation freeing the slaves, but only as a war measure to weaken the South, give us victory, and restore the Constitution. They refused to hear your interpretation. They made their own. Van Allen boldly declares that 99 men out of every 100 whom he represents in Congress breathe no other prayer than to have an end to this hellish war. When news of victory comes, there is no rejoicing. When news of our defeat comes, there is no sorrow." "Is that statement really true?" the sorrowful lips asked. "Of the majority elected him, yes. In the Northwest, distrust and despair are strangling the hearts of the people. More and more we hear the traitorous talk of arraying ourselves against New England and forming a confederacy of our own. More than 2,600 deserters have been arrested within a few weeks in Indiana. It generally requires an armed detail. Most of the deserters, true to the oath of the Order of the Knights of the Golden Circle, desert with their arms. Is it possible? And in one case, 17 out of these fortified themselves in a log cabin with outside paling and ditch for protection and were maintained by their neighbors. 200 armed men in Rush County resisted the arrest of deserters. I was compelled to send infantry by special train to take their ringleaders. Southern Indiana is ripe for revolution. I have positive information that the incoming Democratic legislature of my state is in quick touch with the ones gathering in Illinois and Ohio. In Illinois, your own state, they have already drafted the resolutions demanding an armistice and a convention of all the states to agree to an adjustment of the war. It is certain to pass the Illinois House. My own legislature has put this resolution into a more daring and dangerous form. They propose boldly and at once to acknowledge the Southern Confederacy and demand that the Northwest dissolve all further relations with New England. When they have passed this measure in Indiana, they expect Ohio and Illinois to follow suit. Their secret order, which covers my state with a network of lodges, whose purpose is the withdrawal of the northwestern states from the Union, has obtained a foothold in the army camps in the city of Washington itself. The president rose with quick, nervous energy and paced the floor. He stopped suddenly in front of Morton, his deep-set eyes burning a steady flame. "And what do you propose?" "I haven't decided yet. I have the best of reasons to believe that the first thing my legislature will do when it convenes is to pass a resolution refusing to receive any message from me as governor of the state. Will they dare? I'm sure of it. It will be composed of men sworn to oppose the bitter end of any prosecution of this war. They intend to recognize the Southern Confederacy and dissolve their own federal relations with the United States. It may be necessary, sir," he paused and fixed the president with compelling eyes, "it may be necessary to suspend the civil government in the North in order to save the Union." The president lifted his big hand in a gesture of despair. "God save us from that." "I came here to tell you just this," the governor gravely concluded. "If the crisis comes and I must use force, I expect you to back me." Two big, rugged hands grasped the outstretched ones. "God bless you, Governor Morton. We've got to save this Union, and we're going to do it. Since the day I came into office, I have fought to uphold the supremacy of the civil law. My enemies may force me to use despotic powers to crush it for larger ends, but I hope not. I hope not. God knows I have no vain ambitions. I have no desire to use such power." The governor left him gazing dreamily over the river towards Virginia, a great new sorrow clouding his soul. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 24, The Conspiracy. Lord Lyons, the British minister, was using smooth words to the Secretary of State. Mr. Seward, our wily snuff-dipper, was fully his equal in expressions of polite friendship. What he meant to say, of course, was that he could plunge a poisoned dagger into the British lion with the utmost pleasure. What he said was, "I am pleased to hear from your lordship the expressions of goodwill from her gracious majesty's government. I am sorry to say, however," the minister hastened to add, "that the proclamation of emancipation was not well received by the people of England as favorably as we had hoped." "And why not?" Seward asked politely. "Seeing that it could have no effect in really freeing the slaves until the South is conquered, it appears to be merely an attempt to excite a servile insurrection." The secretary lifted his eyebrows, took another dip of snuff, and softly inquired, "And may I ask of your lordship whether this would not have been more true in the earlier days of the war than now?" "Undoubtedly. And yet I understood that her gracious majesty's government was cold toward us because we had failed to take such high moral grounds at once in the beginning of this war." His lordship lifted his hands in polite admission of the facts. "The trouble, you see," he went on softly, "Europe begins to feel that a division of sentiment in the North will prove a fatal weakness to the administration in so grave a crisis. Unfortunately, from our point of view, of course, your government is a democracy, the sport of every whim of demagogue of the hour." Seward lifted his eye with a quick look at his lordship and smiled. "Allow me to reassure her gracious majesty's government on that point immediately. The administration will find measures of preserving the sovereign power the people have entrusted to it. For example, my lord, I can touch the little bell on my right hand and order the arrest without warrant of a citizen of Ohio. I can touch the little bell on my left and order the imprisonment of a citizen of New York, and no power on earth except that of the president can release them. Can the Queen of Great Britain do as much?" His lordship left, apparently reassured. The tinkle of the little bell on the desk of the Secretary of State, which had begun to fill the jails of the North with her leading Democratic citizens, did not have the same soothing effect on American lawmakers, however. These arrests were made without warrant and the victims held without charges, the right to bail or trial. The president had dared to suspend the great writ of habeas corpus, which guaranteed to every freeman the right to meet his accuser in open court and answer the charges against him. The attitude of the bold, aggressive opposition was voiced on the floor of the House of Representatives in Washington, in no uncertain language, by Daniel Voorhees of Indiana, in a speech whose passionate eloquence was only equaled by its reckless daring. "The present executive of the government," he declared, "has usurped the power of law and justice to an extent subversive of republican institutions and not to be borne by any free people. He has given access to the vaults of prisons, but not to the bar of justice, It is a part of the nature of frail men to sin against laws, both human and divine, but God himself guarantees a fair trial before punishment. Tyrants alone repudiate the justice of the Almighty. To deny an accused man the right to be heard in his own defense is an echo from the dark ages of brutal despotism. We have in this the most atrocious tyranny that ever feasted on the groans of a captive or banqueted on the tears of the widow and orphan. And yet on this spectacle of shame and horror American citizens now gaze. The great bulwark of human liberty which generations and bloody toil have built against the wicked exercise of unlawful power has been torn away by a parricidal hand. Every man today, from the proudest in his mansion to the humblest in his cabin, all stand at the mercy of one man and the fawning minions who crouch before him for pay. We hear on every side the old cry of the courtier and the parasite. At every new aggression, at every additional outrage, new advocates rise to defend the source of patronage, wealth, and fame, the Department of the Executive. Such assistance has always waited on the malignant effort of tyranny. Nero had his poet laureate. Seneca wrote a defense even for the murder of his mother. And this dark hour affords us ample evidence that human nature is the same today as 2,000 years ago. Such speeches cannot be sent broadcast free of charge through the mails without its effect on the minds of thousands. The great political party in opposition to the administration was now arrayed in a solid phalanx against the war itself, on whose prosecution the existence of the nation depended. Again, the radical wing of his party demanded of the president the impossible. The abolitionists had given a tardy and lukewarm support in return for the issue of the Proclamation of Emancipation. Their support lasted but a few days. Through their spokesman, Senator Winter, they demanded the whole loaf. They had received but half of their real program. They asked for a policy of reconstruction in the parts of Louisiana and Tennessee held by the Union Army in accordance with their ideas. They demanded the ballot for every slave, the confiscation of the property of the white people of the South, and its bestowment upon Negroes and camp followers as fast as the Union Army could penetrate the states in rebellion. Senator Winter's argument was based on sound reasoning theoretically, whatever might be said of its wisdom as a national policy. Your Emancipation Proclamation, he declared to the president, provides for the arming and drilling of Negro soldiers to fight for the Republic. If they are good enough to fight, they are good enough to vote. The ballot is only another form of the bayonet which we use in the time of peace. Correct, Senator, was the calm reply. If we'd allow the Negro race to remain in America in physical contact with ours, but we're not going to do this. No greater calamity could befall our people. Colonization and separation must go hand in hand with the emancipation of these children of Africa. I incorporated this principle in my act of emancipation. I have set my life on the issue of its success. As a matter of theory and abstract right, we may grant the suffrage of a few of the more intelligent Negroes and black soldiers we may enroll until they can be removed. Again, we deal with a Southerner, Mr. President. The senator sneered. So be it, was the quiet answer. I've never held any other views. They were well known before the war. But 2 years before my election, I said in my debate with Douglas, I am not, nor have I ever been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. I am not, nor have ever been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever and forbid the two living together on terms of social and political equality. Yet, the senator sneered, you can change your mind. You said in your inaugural that you had no intention or right to interfere with the institution of slavery. You did so just the same, as an act of war to save the Union only. But mark you, I've always hated slavery from principle, for the white man's sake as well as the Negro's. I am equally determined on principle that the Negro race, after it is free, shall never be absorbed into our social or political life. You'll change your principles or retire to private life, the old man snapped. When I have saved the Union, we shall see. Time will indicate the wisdom of my position. I have no longer any ambition except to give the best that's in me to my people. The breach between the president and the most powerful leader of his own party was now complete. It was a difference that was fundamental and irreconcilable. They asked him to extend the autocratic power he wielded to preserve the Union in a time of war to a program of revenge and proscription against the South as it should fall before the advancing army. His answer was simple. Secession was void from the beginning. The South shall not be laid waste as conquered territory when the Union's restored. They shall return as our brethren to live with us in peace and goodwill, with the curse of slavery lifted from them and their children. Nor will I permit the absorption of this black blood into our racial stock to degrade our national character. When free, the Negro must return to his own. With fierce, sullen determination, the radical wing of his party organized a secret, powerful conspiracy to drive Abraham Lincoln from public life. Behind this first line of attack stood the Democratic Party with its millions of loyal voters, now united under General George B. McClellan. The radicals and the Democrats hated each other with a passion second only to their hatred of the president. They agreed to remove him first and then settle their own differences. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Southerner, Romance of the Real Lincoln, by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 25, The Tug of War. Betty Winter, having made up her mind to put John Vaughan out of her life for all time, volunteered for field service as a nurse and by permission of the president joined Burnside's army before Fredericksburg. The general had brought its effective fighting force to 113,000. Lee's army confronted him on the other side of the Rappahannock with 75,000 men. A great battle was impending. Burnside had reluctantly assumed command. He was a gallant, genial, cultured soldier, a gentleman of the highest type, a pure, unselfish patriot with not a trace of vulgar ambition or self-seeking. He saw the president hounded and badgered by his own party, assaulted and denounced in the bitterest terms by the opposition, and he knew that the remedy could be found only in a fighting, victorious army. A single, decisive victory would turn the tide of public opinion, unite the faction-ridden army, and thrill the nation with enthusiasm. He determined to fight at once and risk his fate as a commander on the issue of victory or defeat. His council of war had voted against an attack on Lee's army in Fredericksburg. Burnside brushed their decision aside as part of a quarrel McClellan had left. Even the men in the ranks were fighting each other daily in these miserable bickerings and intrigues. A victory was the remedy for their troubles, and he made up his mind to fight for it. The general received Betty with the greatest courtesy. "You're more than welcome at this moment, Miss Winter. The surgeons won't let you in some of their field hospitals, but there's work to be done preparing our corps for the battle we're going to fight. You'll have plenty to do." "Thank you, General," she gravely answered. Burnside read for the second time the gracious letter from the president which Betty presented. "You're evidently pretty strong with this administration, Miss Betty," he remarked. "Yes, the patience and wisdom of the president is a hobby of mine." "Then I'll ask you to review the army with me. You can report to him." Within an hour they were passing in serried lines before the commander. Betty watched the march with a thrill of patriotic pride. 113,000 men, their dark blue uniforms pouring past like the waters of a mighty river, the December sun gleaming on their polished bayonets as on so many icicles flashing on its surface. Her heart was suddenly stood still. There before marched John Vaughan in an outer line of a regiment, his eyes straight forward, looking neither to the right nor the left. He was a private in the ranks, clean and sober, his face rugged, strong, and sun-tanned. For a moment there was a battle inside that tested her strength. He had not seen her and was oblivious of her existence, apparently, but she had noted the regiment under whose flag he marched. It would be easy to find him if she wished. When the first moment of lovesickness and utter longing passed, she had no desire to see him. The dead could bury its dead. Her love was a thing of the past. The cruel thing in this man's nature she had seen on the first day was still there. She saw it with a shudder in his red, half-drunken eyes the day they met in Washington. Saw it so plainly, so glaringly, the memory of it could never fade. He was sober and in his right mind now, his cheeks bronzed with the new life of sunshine and open air the army had given. The thing was still there. It spoke in the brute strength of his powerful body as his marching feet struck the ground, in the iron look about his broad shoulders, the careless strength with which he carried his musket as if it were a feather, and above all, in the hard cold glint from his shining eyes set straight in front. She lay awake for hours on the little white cot at the headquarters of the ambulance corps, reviewing her life, and dropped to sleep at last with a deep sense of gratitude to God that she was free and could give herself an unselfish devotion to her country. Her last waking thoughts were of Ned Vaughn and the sweet, foolish worship he had laid at her feet. She wondered vaguely if he was in those gray lines beyond the river. Ned Vaughn was there this time, back with his regiment. Lee, Jackson, and Longstreet had known for days that a battle was imminent. Their scouts from over the river had brought positive information. The Confederate leaders had already planned the conflict. Their battle lines circled the hills beyond Fredericksburg, spread out in a crescent 5 miles long. Nature had piled these 5 miles of hills around Fredericksburg as if to build an impregnable fortress. On every crest, concealed behind every tree and bushes, the Confederate artillery was in place, its guns trained to sweep the wide plain with double crossfire, besides sending a storm of shot and shells straight from the center. 60,000 matchless gray infantry crouched among those bushes and lay beside stone walls in sunken roadways or in newly turned trenches. The great fan-shaped death trap had been carefully planned and set by a master mind. Only a handful of sharpshooters and a few pieces of artillery had been left in Fredericksburg to dispute the passage of the river and deceive Burnside with a pretense of defending the town. The Confederate soldier was ragged and his shoes were tied together with strings. His uniform consisted of an old hat or cap, usually without a brim, a shirt of striped bed ticking so brown it seemed woven of grass. The buttons were of discolored cow's horn. His coat was the color of Virginia dust and mud, and it was out at the elbow. His socks were homemade, knit by loving hands, swift and tender in their endless work of love. The socks were the best thing he had. The one spotless thing about him was his musket, and the bayonet he carried at his side. His spirits were high. A barefooted soldier had managed to get home and secure a pair of boots. He started back to his regiment, hurrying to be in time for the fight. The new boots hurt him so terribly he couldn't wear them. He passed Ned's regiment with his precious footgear hanging on his arms. "Hello, Sonny, what command?" Ned cried. "Company E, 12th Virginia, Mahone's brigade," he proudly answered. "Yes, damn you," a soldier drawled from the grass, "and you're pulled your boots off, holding them in your hand, ready to run now." The laugh ran along the line, and the boy hurried off to escape the chaff. A well-known chaplain rode along a narrow path on the hillside. He was mounted on an old horse whose hip bones protruded like two deadly fangs. A footsore Confederate was hobbling as fast as he could in front of him, glancing back over his shoulder now and then uneasily. "You needn't be afraid, my friend," the parson called. "I'm not going to run you over." "I know you ain't," the soldier laughed, "but if I was to let you pass me and that thing was to wobber, I'd be doggoned if I wouldn't be gored to death." The preacher reined in his steed with dignity, and he spoke with wounded pride. "My friend, this is a better horse than our Lord rode into Jerusalem on." The soldier stepped up quickly, opened the animal's mouth, and said, "Parson, that's the very same horse." A shout rose from the hill, in which the preacher joined. "Dod-bam-it, did you ever hear the beat of that?" shouted a pious fellow who was inventing cuss words that would pass the charge of profanity. A distinguished citizen of Fredericksburg passed along the lines wearing a tall new silk hat. He didn't get very far before he changed the line of march. A regular fusillade poured on him from the ranks. "Say, man, is that a hat or a bee-gum? Come down now. Come out in that hat and help us with these Yanks. Come down, I say. I know you're up there, for I can see your legs." When the silk hat vanished, a solemn country boy with slight knowledge of books began to discuss the great mysteries of eternity. Ned had won his unbounded faith and admiration by spelling at the first trial the name of his native village in the Valley of Virginia, McGaysville. Tom held this fact to be a marvelous intellectual achievement. "What I want to know, Ned, is this," he drawled. "Who started sin in this world anyhow? What makes a good thing good and what makes a bad thing bad? And who said so first? That's what I'd like to know myself, Tom, Ned gravely answered. And you don't know? I certainly do not. I don't see why any man that can spell like you don't know everything. He paused, picked up a pebble, and threw it at a comrade's foot and laughed to see him jump as from a minie ball. You know, Ned, he went on slowly, what I think is the prettiest piece of poetry? No, what? It's this. The men of high condition that rules affairs of state, their purpose is ambition, their practice only hate. Pretty good, Tom, was the quick reply. But I can beat it with something more hopeful. I got it in Sunday school out in Missouri. The sword and spear of needless worth shall prune the tree and plow the earth, and peace shall smile from shore to shore, and nations learn to war no more. The country boy's eyes gleamed with eager approval. He had fought for nearly 2 years, and the glory of war was beginning to lose its glamour. Say that again, Ned, he pleaded. Say it again. That's the prettiest thing I ever heard in my life. He was silent a moment. Yes, I used to think it'd be glorious to hear the thunder of guns and the shriek of shells. Changed my mind. When I hear one of 'em coming now, I begin to sing to myself the old-fashioned tune I used to hear in the revivals. Hark from the tomb a doleful sound. My thoughts on dreadful subjects roll damnation and the dead. I've an idea we're going to sing some of them old songs on this field pretty soon. Again Ned thought of John and offered a silent prayer that he might not be in those blue lines which were going to charge into the jaws which death had opened for him in the valley below. John Vaughn, in his tent beyond the Rappahannock, was wasting no energy worrying about the coming battle. Death had ceased to be a matter of personal concern. He had seen so many dead and wounded men as he had ridden over the battlefields, he had come to take them as a matter of course. He was going into action now for the first time in the ranks as a private soldier, and he would see things happen at closer range. That was all. He wished to see them that way. He had reached the point of utter indifference to personal danger, and it brought a new consciousness of strength that was inspiring. He had stopped dreaming of the happiness of love after the exhibition he had made of himself before Betty Winter and the brutal insult with which he had met her advances. Some girls might forgive it, but not this proud, sensitive, high-strung daughter of the snows of New England and the sunlight of France. And so he had resolutely put the thought out of his heart. Julius had proven him a valuable servant. He was the best cook in the regiment, and what was still more important, he was the most skillful thief and the most plausible liar in the army. He could defend himself so nobly from the insinuations of the suspicious that they would apologize for the wrong unwittingly done his character. John had not lived so well since he could remember. Julius, you're a handy man in war, he exclaimed, after a hearty supper on fried chicken. Yassa, I managed to get along, sir. Julius took up his banjo and began to tune it for accompaniment to his songs. He had a mellow, rhythmical voice that always brought the crowd. He began with his favorite that never failed to please his master. The way he rolled his eyes and sang with his hands and feet and every muscle of his body was the source of unending interest to his northern audience. He ran his fingers lightly over the strings, and then men threw down their dirty packs of cards and crowded around John's tent. Julius only sang one line at a time and picked his banjo between them to a low wailing sound of his own invention. Oh, fire you will, my Marianne, fire you will, my dear. I's got no one left to love me nows, and little do I care. He paused between the stanzas and picked his banjo to a few prose interpolations of his own. That's why I'm telling you, folks, little do I cares. He knew his master had been crossed and loved, and he rolled his eyes and nodded his woolly head in triumphant approval. John smiled wanly as he drifted slowly into his next stanza. And if I has a scolding wife, I'd whip as sure as you bone. I'd take her down to New Orleans and trade her off for corn. Julius stopped with a sudden snap and whispered to John, Lordy, sir, I clean forget about that meeting at the Cub Folk Church, sir, and they start up. I promised the preacher to fetch you, sir, and if we go on to march tomorrow, this here's the last night's show. The concert was adjourned to the log house, which an old colored preacher had converted to a church. It was filled to capacity, and John stood in the doorway and heard the most remarkable sermon to which he'd ever listened. The gray-haired old Negro was tremendously in earnest. He could neither read nor write, but he opened the Bible to comply with the formalities of the occasion and pretended to read its text. He had taken it from his master, who was a clergyman. Ephraim invariably chose the same text, but gave his people his own interpretations. It never failed in some element of originality. The text his master had evidently chosen were the words, "And he healeth them of diverse diseases." Old Ephraim's version was a free one. From the open Bible he solemnly read, "And he healed them also to diseases, even at the worst complaints called the divers." He plunged straight into a fervent exhortation to sinners to flee from the divers. "I gon' tell you, chillins," he exclaimed with uplifted arms, you don't know nothing about those terrible diseases till there was called them divers you get you. It gon' get you too. You can flee to the mountaintops and he'll drive up there for get you there. You can go down in the bowels of the earth and he'll dive right down there after you. You can take the wings of the morning and fly to the ends of the earth. And the divers is there. They can dive anywhere. And what you gonna do when they get you? I ask you now, what you gonna do when it's forever eternally too late? These doctors around here carry over the whoop and cough maybe. I ain't never seen them ever do that, but I say maybe they can cure you the maybe. The plumbago, the typhoids, or the yellow fever sometimes, but I warn you now to flee to the raft to come when the divers get you. There ain't no doctor for good folk that nowhere, except coming to the Lord, for he heals you all sorts of them diseases and the worst, and all to come and go to divers. Come, humble sinner, who breasts 1,000 revolves. Yes, sir. John Vaughn turned away with a smile and a tear. "In God's name," he murmured thoughtfully, "what's to become of these 4 million black children of the tropics? Jungles, if we win now and set them free. Their fathers and mothers were but yesterday eating human flesh in naked savagery." He walked slowly back to his tent through the solemn starlit night. The new moon, a silver thread, hung over the treetops. He thought of that dusky, gray-haired child of 4,000 years of ignorance and helplessness, and the tragic role he had played in the history of our people. And for the first time he faced the question of the still more tragic role he might play in the future. "I'm fighting to free him and the millions like him," he mused. "What am I going to do with him?" The longer he thought, the blacker and more insoluble became the question, and yet he was going to battle tomorrow to fight his own brother to the death on the issue. True, the problem of national existence was at stake, but this black problem of the possible degradation of our racial stock and our national character still lay back a bit unsolved and possibly insoluble. The red flash of a picket's gun on the shore of the river and the quick answer from the other side brought his dreaming to a sudden stop before the sterner fact of the swiftly approaching battle. He snatched but a few hours' sleep before his regiment was up and on the march to the water's edge. A dense gray fog hung over the river and obscured the town. The bridge builders swung on their pontoons into the water, and soon the sound of timbers falling into place could be heard with the splash of the anchors and the low, quick commands of the officers. The gray sharpshooters, concealed on the other shore, began to fire across the water through the fog. The sound was strangely magnified. The single crack of a musket seemed as loud as a cannon. The work went quick. The bullets flew wide of the mark. The fog suddenly lifted, and a steady fusillade from the men hidden on the hills of Fredericksburg began to pick off the bridge builders with cruel accuracy. At times every man was down. New men were rushed to take their places, and they fell. The signal was given to the artillery, and 147 great guns began to sweep the doomed town. Houses crumbled like eggshells, and fires began to blaze. The sharpshooters fell back, the bridges were laid, and the grand army of 113,000 began to pour across. The caissons, with their huge black rifle-barrel guns rumbling along the resounding boards, a continuous roar like distant thunder. On the southern shore, the deep mud-cut hills pour every team to the test of its strength and the utmost skill of their drivers. Hundreds of men were in the mud at the wheels, and still they would stick. And then the patient heavens above heard the voices of army teamsters in plain and ornamental swearing. Such profanity was probably never heard on this earth before, and it may well be hoped it will not be heard again. The driver whose wheels had stuck cracked his whip first and yelled. He yelled again and cracked his whip again. He began to swear loudly and angrily at first, and then in lower, steadier, more polite terms, but always in an unending, nerve-wracking torrent. He cursed his mules individually by name and the whole team collectively, and consigned it to the lowest depth, the deepest hell, and then the devil for not providing a deeper one. Each trait of each mule, good and bad, he named without fear or favor, and damned each alike with equal emphasis. He named each part of each mule's anatomy and damned it individually and as a whole, with a full bill of particulars. He swore in every key the whole gamut of sound, and last of all, he damned himself for his utter inability to express anything he really felt. The last big gun up the hill and the infantry poured into the town of Fredericksburg, halting in regiments and brigades in the streets. Only a few shots had been exchanged with the men in gray. They had withdrawn to the heights a mile beyond. The assault had been a mere parade. Many of the inhabitants had fled in terror at the approach of the men in blue. Some of the lower types of soldiers in the Northern Army broke into the deserted homes and began to rob and pillage. Julius found many delicacies lying about on lawns and in various unheard-of places. His master never pressed him with rude questions when his zeal bore such good results at their table. Ned Vaughn had been very much amused that an old woman who had been driven from her home by marauders, she had piled such goods and chattels as she could handle into an ox cart and drove past the gray battle lines, hurrying as fast as she could southward. Her wrinkled old face beamed with joy at the sight of their burnished muskets, and her eyes flashed at the gleam of an Amazon as she shouted, "Give it to the damn rascals, boys. Give 'em one for me, and don't you forget it." Far down the line she could be heard delivering her fierce exhortations. The men smiled and answered her good-naturedly. The day of wrath and death had dawned. It was too solemn an hour for boastful words. For 2 days the Grand Army in blue poured across the river and spread out through the town of Fredericksburg. The fateful morning of the 13th of December, 1862, dawned in another heavy fog. Its gray mantle of mystery shrouded the town, clung wet and heavy to the grounds in the silent valley before the crescent-shaped hills, and veiled the face of the heights. Under the cover of this fog, the long waves of blue spread out in the edge of the valley and took their places in the battle lines. The gray men in the brown grass on the hills crouched behind their ditches and stone walls, gripped their guns, and waited for the foe to walk into the trap their commanders had set. An unseen hand slowly lifted the misty curtain, and the sun burst onto the scene. The valley lay like the smooth ground of some vast arena prepared for a pageant, and back of it rose the silent hills, tier on tier like the seats of a mighty amphitheater. But the men crouching on those seats were not spectators. They were the grimmest actors in the tragedy. For a moment it was spectacle merely, the grandest display of the pageantry of war ever made on a field of death. Franklin's division suddenly wheeled into position for its united assault on the right. Ned Vaughn, from his lair on the hill, could see the officers in their magnificent new uniforms, their swords flashing as they led their men. 100,000 bayonets were gleaming in the sparkling December sun. Magnificent horses and rich tasseled trappings were plunging and prancing with their excitement of marching hosts, some of them helping to keep time to the throb of regimental bands. The bands were playing now, all of them, a band for every 1,000 men, the shrill scream of their bugles and the roar of their drums sending a mighty chorus into the heavens that echoed ominously against the silent hills. And flags were streaming in billowy waves of red, white, and blue as far as the eye could reach. "Isn't it pretty, boys?" Ned sighed admiringly. Tom lifted his solemn eyes from the grass. Lord, look at them new warm clothes, and my elbows are freezing this cold wind. Ain't it a picture? What a pity to spoil it." A ripple of admiration ran along the crouching lines as fingers softly felt for the triggers of their guns. A quick order from John Vaughn's colonel sent the battery of artillery rattling and bounding into position. The cannoneers sprang to their mounts. A handsome young fellow missed his foothold and fell beneath the wheels. The big iron tire crushed his neck, and the blood from his mouth splashed into John's face. The men on the guns didn't turn their head to look back. Their eyes were searching the brown hills before them. The long roll beat from 1,000 drums. The call of the buglers rang over the valley, and then the strange solemn silence that comes before the shock, the moment when cowards collapse and the brave falter. John Vaughn's soul rose in a fierce challenge to fate. If he died, it was well. If he lived, it was the same. He had ceased to care. At exactly 8:30, General Meade hurled his division, supported by Doubleday and Gibbon, against Jackson's weakest point, the right of the Confederate lines. Their aim was to seize an opening hill. The curving line of gray were silent until the charging hosts were well advanced in deadly range, and then the brown hills flamed and roared in front and on their flank. The blue lines were mowed down in swaths. as though the giant figure of death had suddenly swung his scythe from the fog banks to the sky. Again and again came these awful volleys of musketry and artillery, cross-firing on the rushing lines. The men staggered and recovered, reformed and charged again over the dead bodies of their comrades, carrying the crest for a moment. They captured a flag and a handful of prisoners, only to be driven back down the hill with losses more frightful in retreat than when they breasted the storm. In the center, the tragedy was repeated with results even more terrible. As the charging lines fell back, staggering, bleeding, cut to pieces, fresh brigades threw down their knapsacks, fixed their bayonets, and charged through their own melting ranks into the jaws of death, to fall back at their turn. With a mighty shout, the Blue Line swept across the railroad, took the ditches at the point of the bayonet, and captured 200 gray prisoners, but only for a moment. From the supporting line rang the rebel yell, and they were hurled back, shattered, cut to pieces. The retreats were veritable shambles of slaughter, the curved lines on the hill ranking them with their deadly accurate crossfire. John Vaughan's regiment leaped to the support of the falling blue waves. A wounded soldier propped himself up against a stone and smiled as the cheering men swept by. He could rest a while now. A battery of artillery suddenly blazed from the hill crest, and the colonels threw his command flat on their stomachs until the storm should slacken. John heard the shrill, deadly swish of the big shots passing 2 feet above. He lifted his eyes to the hill, and a frightened pigeon suddenly swooped straight down toward his head. He ducked quickly, sure he had escaped a cannonball, until the laugh of the man at his side told of his mistake. They rose to charge. The knapsack of the man who had laughed was struck by a ball, and a deck of cards sent flying 10 feet into the air. "Deal me a winning hand," John shouted. A shot cut the sword belt of the first lieutenant, left him uninjured, glanced and killed the captain. The lieutenant picked up his sword, took his captain's place, and led the charge. Men were falling on the right and left, and John Vaughan loaded and fired with steady, dogged nerve, without a scratch. 4 times the blue billows had dashed against the hills, only to fall back in red confusion. The din and roar were indescribable. The color-bearer of the regiment, confused by conflicting orders, paused and asked for instructions. The colonel, mistaking his act for retreat, tore the colors from his hand and gave them to another man. The boy burst into tears. The new color-bearer had scarcely lifted the flag above his head when he fell. The disgraced soldier snatched the tottering flagstaff and, lifting it on high, dashed up the hill ahead of his line of battle. The men were ducking their heads low beneath the fierce hail of lead and staggering blindly. John saw this boy waving his flag, shaking his fist at the holding lines. He was not 100 feet from the Confederate trenches. "Come on there," he shouted. "Damn it, what's the matter with you?" Ned Vaughan and his gray men behind the little mound of red dirt were watching the drama with flashing eyes. Beside him crouched a boy whose early piety had marked him for the ministry, but he had wandered from the fold in the stress of an army life. Ned heard his voice, now in low, eager prayer. "O Lord, drive 'em back, O Lord." He fired his musket down the hill and prayed harder. "Lord, drive 'em back. Sin and come short, but drive 'em, O Lord." He paused and whispered to Ned as he reached for another cartridge. "Are they coming or going?" "Coming." Again he prayed with fervor. "Drive 'em back, Lord God Almighty. We're weak and you're strong. Help us now. Drive 'em just this time, O Lord, and you can have me. I'll be good." He paused for a breath and turned to Ned. "Now look, coming or going? That fellow with the flag cussing the men has dropped. Thank God. Another's lifted it. Lord save us." "Why don't you lie down, you dang fool?" Tom shouted. "I'm hugging the ground so close. I don't want a piece of paper under me. If there's got to be a piece, I don't want no writing on it." "Now look, are they coming or going?" the pious boy gasped. Ned made no answer. His wide-set eyes were staring at the man who had caught the color-bearer in his arms and was carrying him to the rear. It was John Vaughan. His lips were moving now in silent prayer, and his sword hung limp in his hands. Through chattering teeth he cried, "Don't shoot that fella carrying his friend down the hill, boys." "They're running now?" the pious one said. "It isn't war, it's a massacre," Ned sighed. The man of prayer leaped on the ditch bank suddenly and shook his fist defiantly. "Come back here, you dang cowards," he yelled. "Come back and we'll whip the hell out of you." Slowly the shattered regiment fell back down the bloody slope, stumbling over their dead and wounded. The dim, smoke-bound valley was a slaughter pen, where magnificent lines of blue had marched with flashing bayonets and streaming banners at 8 o'clock. The dead lay in mangled heaps, and the wounded huddled among them, slowly freezing to death. John saw a magnificent gun, a heap of junk, with 4 dead horses and every cannoneer on the ground, dead or freezing where they fell. A single shell had done the work. Riderless horses galloped wildly over the fields, shying at the grim piles of dark blue bodies, sniffing the blood and neighing pitifully. 1,200 men in his regiment had charged up that hill, but 250 came down. From the steeple of the courthouse in Fredericksburg, General Couch, in command of the 2nd Corps, stood with his glasses on the frightful scene. He whispered to Howard by his side, "The whole plan is covered with our men, fallen and falling. I've never seen anything like it." He paused, his lips quivering as he gasped, "Oh, my God, I see them falling. Poor fellows. Falling." He signaled Burnside for reinforcements. General Sumner's division on the Union right had charged into the deadliest trap of them all. Down the road towards the foot of Marye's Heights, his magnificent army swept at double quick. The Confederate batteries had been specially trained to rake this road from 3 directions, right and left, flank and center. Steadily, stoically, the men in blue pressed into this narrow way in silence and met the flaming torrent from 3 directions. Rushing on over the bodies of their fallen comrades, the thinning ranks reached the old stone wall at the foot of the hill. General Cobb lay concealed behind it with 3,000 infantry. The low, quick order ran along his line. Fire! Straight into the faces of the heroic Union soldiers flashed a level, blinding flame from 3,000 muskets, slaying, crushing, tearing to pieces the proud army of an hour ago. The 1,000 men in blue fell in 5 minutes. The ground was piled with their bodies until it was impossible to charge over them effectively. For a moment, a cloud of smoke pitifully drew a soft gray veil over the awful scene, while the men who were left fell back in straggling, broken groups. 5 times the Union hosts had charged these terrible brown hills, and 5 times they had been rolled back in red waves of blood. Late in the day, a fierce, bitter wind was blowing from the north. There was yet time to turn defeat into victory. The desperate Union commander ordered the 6th charge. The men in blue pulled their hats down low as if to shut out the pelting hail of lead and iron, and without a murmur charged once more into the mouths of hell. The winds had frozen the stiff bodies of the dead. The advancing blue lines snatched these dead men from the ground, carried them in front, stacked them in long piles for bulwarks, and fought behind them with the desperation of madmen. There was no escape. The keen eyes of the Confederate commanders had planted their right and left flanking lines to pour death into these ranks, no matter how high their corpses were piled. The Crescent Hills blazed and roared with unceasing fury. Only the darkness was kind at last. And then the men in blue planted the frozen bodies of their comrades along the outer battle lines as dummy sentinels, and under the cover of night began to slip back through Fredericksburg and across the silver mirror of the Rappahannock to their old camp, shattered, broken, crushed. It was 4 o'clock in the morning before John Vaughan's regiment would give up the search for the desperately wounded. Only the strongest could endure that bitter cold. Through the long, desolate hours, the pitiful cries of wounded men rang through the black, freezing night, and few hands stirred to save them. A great army was fighting to save its flags and guns and reach the shelter beyond the river. Amid the few flickering lanterns could be heard the greetings of friends in subdued tones as they clasped hands. "Is that you, old boy? God bless you. Yes, I'm glad to see you." A dying man in blue was pitifully calling for water somewhere in the darkness in front of Ned Vaughan's ditch. He took his canteen, got a lantern, and went to find him. It might be John. If not, no matter. It was some other fellow's brother. As the light fell on his face, Ned murmured, "Thank God." He pressed the canteen to his lips and held his head in his lap. It was only too plain from the steel look of his eyes that the minutes were numbered. He moved and turned his dying face up to Ned. "Why is it you always whip us, Johnny?" He paused for breath. "I wonder every battle I've been in we've been defeated. Why, oh God, why?" His head drooped and he was still. Ned wondered if some waiting loved one on the shores of eternity had given him the answer. He wrapped him tenderly in his blanket and left him at rest at last. As he turned towards the lines, the unmistakable wail of a baby came faintly through the darkness. A wee voice, the half-smothered cry sounding as if it were nestling in a mother's arms. He followed the sounds until his lantern flashed in the wild eyes of a young woman who had fled her from her home in terror during the battle and was hugging her baby frantically in her arms. Ned led her gently to an officer's quarter and made her comfortable. The glory of war was fast fading from his imagination. A grim specter was slowly taking its place. John's shattered regiment lay down on the field, with the rear guard at 4 o'clock, to snatch an hour's sleep, their heads pillowed on the bodies of the dead. The cold moderated, and a light mantle of snow fell softly just before day and covered the field, the living and the dead. When the reveille sounded at dawn, the bugler looked with awe the thousands of white-shrouded figures and wondered what would stir at his note. The living slowly rose as from the dead and shook their white shrouds. Thousands lay still, cold and immovable, to await the archangel's mightier call at the last. Beyond the river, through the long night, Burnside, wild with anguish, had paced the floor of his tent. Again and again he threw his arms in a gesture of despair toward the freezing, blood-stained field. Oh, those men over there, I'm thinking of them all the time. As the rear guard turned from the field at sunrise, John Vaughan looked back across the valley of death and saw the ragged brown and gray figures shivering in the cold as they swarmed down from the hills and began to shake the frost from the new warm clothes they were stripping from the dead. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 26, The Rest Hour. For 2 terrible days and nights, Betty Winter saw the endless lines of ambulances creep from the fields of Fredericksburg. Some of these men lay on the frozen ground for 48 hours before relief came. Many of the wounded might have lived but for the frightful exposure to cold which followed the battle. They died in hundreds. Thousands were placed on trains for Washington, and so great was the pitiful suffering among them, Betty left with the first load. There would be more work in hospitals than in Burnside's camp. It would be many a day before his shattered army could be ready again to give battle. The worst trouble with it was not the bleeding gap torn through its ranks by Lee's shot and shell. Not only was its body wounded, its soul was crushed. Its commanding generals were divided into warring factions, the rank and file of its stern fighting men discouraged. Again, an epidemic of desertions broke out, and 10,000 men were lost in a single month. Burnside assumed full responsibility for the disaster and asked to be relieved of his command. The 3rd Union general had gone down before Lee, McClellan, Pope, and Burnside. The president, heartsick but undismayed, called to the head of the army the most promising general in sight, Joseph Hooker, popularly known as Fighting Joe Hooker. There was inspiration to the thoughtless in the name. The chief had misgivings. On sending the appointment, he wrote his new general a remarkable letter. General, I have placed you at the head of the Army of the Potomac. Of course, I have done this upon what appears to me to be sufficient reasons, and yet I think it is best for you to know that there are some things in regard to which I am not quite satisfied with you. I believe you to be a skillful and a brave soldier, which of course I like. I also believe you do not mix politics with your profession, in which you are right. You have confidence in yourself, which is a valuable if not indispensable quality. You are ambitious, which within reasonable bounds does good rather than harm. But I think that during General Burnside's command of the army you have taken counsel of your ambition and thwarted him as much as you could, in which you did a great wrong to the country and to a most meritorious and honorable brother officer. I have heard in such a way as to believe of you recently saying that both the army and the government needed a dictator. Of course it was not for this, but in spite of it, that I gave you the command. Only those generals who gain successes can set up as dictators. What I ask now of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship. The government will support you to the utmost of its ability, which is neither more nor less than it has done and will do for all its commanders. I much fear that the spirit which you have aided to infuse into the army of criticizing their commander and withholding confidence from him will now turn upon you. I shall assist you as far as I can to put it down. Neither you nor Napoleon, if he were alive again, could get any good out of an army while such a spirit prevails in it. And now beware of rashness, but with energy and sleepless vigilance go forward and give us victories. While Hooker lay in winter quarters, reorganizing his army, his picket lines, and speaking distance with those of his opponents across the river, the president bent his strong shoulders to the task of cheering the fainting spirits of the people. On his shaggy head was heaped the blame of all the sorrows, failures, and agony of the ever-deepening tragedy of war. Deeper and deeper into his rugged, kindly face were cut the lines of life and death, and darker grew the shadows through which his sensitive, lonely soul was called to walk. And yet through it all there glowed with stronger radiance the charm of his quaint genius and his magnetic personality, tragic, homely, gentle, humorous, honest, merciful, wise, laughable, and lovable. He found time to run down to Hampton Roads with Gideon Welles, his loyal Secretary of the Navy, to inspect the ships assembled there. He saw a narrow door bound with iron. "What's that?" he asked sharply. "Oh, that's a sweat box," the secretary replied, "used for insubordinate seamen." "Oh," the rugged giant exclaimed. "How do you work it?" "The man to be punished is put inside, and steam heat is turned on. It brings him to terms quickly." The tall figure bent curiously, examining the contrivance. "We apply this to the thousands of brave American seamen every year?" "Undoubtedly." "Let me try it and see what it's like." It was useless to protest. He had already taken off his tall silk hat, and there was a look of quiet determination in his hazel gray eyes. He stepped quickly into the enclosure, which he found to be about 3 feet in length and about the same width. His tall figure, 6 feet 4, was practically telescoped. "Close the door now and turn on the steam," he ordered. "I'll give you the signal when I've had enough." The door was closed and the steam turned on. He stood at 3 minutes and gave the signal of release. He stepped out, stretched his long legs, and breathed deeply. He mopped his brow, and there was fire in his somber eyes. He turned to Wells. "Mr. Secretary, I want every one of those things dumped into the sea. Never again allow it to be found on a vessel flying the American flag." In an hour, every sailor in the harbor had heard the news. The old salts, who had felt its shame and agony, lifted their caps and stood with bared heads, cheering and crying as he passed. One by one, every country of Europe heard the news, and the sweat box ceased to be an instrument of discipline on every sea of the civilized world. Seated at his desk in the White House, he received daily the great and humble, and no man or woman came and left without a patient hearing. There were over 30,000 cases of trial and condemnation by court-martial every year, only a small portion with the death penalty attached, but all had the right to appeal. They were not slow in finding the road to the loving heart. Stanton, worn out by vain protest against his pardon, sent Attorney General Bates at last. The great lawyer was very stern as he faced his chief. "I regret to say it, Mr. President, but you are not fit to be trusted with the pardoning power, sir." A smile played about the corner of the big kindly mouth as he glanced over his spectacles at his Attorney General. "It's my private opinion, Bates, that you're just as pigeon-hearted as I am." Judge Advocate General Holt was sent to labor with him and insist that he enforce the law imposing the death penalty. "Your reasons are good, Holt," he answered kindly, "but I can't promise to do it. You see, so many of my boys have to be shot anyhow. I don't want to add another one to that lot if I can help it." He paused and went on whimsically. "I don't see how it's going to make a man better to shoot him anyhow. Give him another trial." In spite of all Holt's protests, he steadfastly refused to sanction any death warrants against a man for cowardice under fire. "Many a man," he calmly argued, "who honestly tries to do his duty is overcome by fear greater than his will. I'm not at all sure how I'd act if many balls were whistling and those big shells shrieking in my ears. How can a poor man help it if his legs just carry him away?" All these he marked leg cases, put them in a separate pigeonhole, and always suspended their sentence. He would smile gently as he filed each death warrant away. "It would frighten that poor devil too terribly to shoot him. They shan't do it." On one he wrote, "Let him fight again. Maybe the enemy will shoot him. I won't." Betty Winter came with 2 cases. The first was a mother to plead for a boy sentenced to die for sleeping at his post on guard. "You see, sir," the mother pleaded, "he'd been on watch once that night and had done his duty faithfully. He volunteered to take a sick comrade's place. He was so tired he fell asleep. He was always a big-hearted, generous boy. You won't just let him shoot him?" "No, won't." was the quick response. The mother laughed aloud through her tears and threw her arms around Betty's neck. The president bent over the paper and wrote across its back, "Pardon, this life is too precious to be lost." Betty waited until the crowd had passed out and he was alone with Colonel Nicolay. She hurried to his desk with her second case, which she had kept outside in the corridor until time to enter. A young mother walked timidly in, smiling apologetically. She carried a 3-month-old baby in her arms. She was evidently not in mourning, though her eyes were red from weeping. "What's the matter now?" the president laughed, nodding to Betty. "Tell him." "If you please, sir," the woman began timidly. "We have been married but little over a year. My husband's never seen the baby. He's in the Army. I couldn't stand it any longer, so I come down to Washington to get a pass to take the baby to him. But they wouldn't let me have it. I've been wandering around the streets all day crying till I met this sweet young lady, and she brought me to you, sir." The president turned to her secretary. "Let's send her down." The colonel smiled and shook his head. "The strictest orders have been given to allow no more women to go to the front." The big, gentle hand stroked the shaggy beard. "Well, tell you what we can do," he cried joyfully. "Give her husband a leave of absence and let him come to see her here." The secretary left at once for the adjutant general's office, and the president turned to the laughing young mother who was trying to thank Betty through her tears. "Where are you stopping, madam?" "Nowhere yet, sir. I went straight from the depot to the War Department and then walked about blind with crying eyes until I came here." "All right, then. We'll fix that. I'll give Miss Betty an order to take you and your baby to her hospital and care for you until your husband comes, and he can stay there a week with you." The mother's voice wouldn't work. She tried to speak her thanks and could only laugh. The big hand pressed on Betty's as she left. "Thank you for bringing her, little girl. Things like that rest me." The hour was swiftly coming when he was going to need all the strength that rest could bring body and soul. His enemies were sleepless. The press, inspired by Senator Winter, had begun to strike below the belt. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Southerner, A Romance of the Real Lincoln by Thomas Dixon. Chapter 27, Deepening Shadows. Again the eyes of the nation were fixed on the Army of the Potomac and its new general. The president went down to his headquarters at Falmouth Heights, opposite Fredericksburg, to review his army of 130,000 men. Riding up to Hooker's headquarters through the beautiful spring morning, his weary figure was lifted with new hope as he breathed the perfume of flowers and blooming hedgerows. The driver was only worried for him at the moment. He was swearing eloquently at his team in the pride of his heart at the honor of hauling the chief magistrate of the nation. He swore both plain and ornamental oaths with equal unction. The president endured it a while in amused silence. He was deeply annoyed, but too much of a gentleman to hurt his patriotic driver's feelings. At last, he observed, "I see you're an Episcopalian, driver." The man turned in surprise. "Oh, no, sir, I'm a Methodist." "Is it possible?" "Yes, sir, a Methodist." "Why, sir?" A whimsical smile played about the big, kindly mouth. "I thought you must be an Episcopalian because you swore exactly like Mr. Seward, and he's a church warden." A deep silence fell on the sweet spring air. The driver glanced over his shoulders with a sheepish grin and cracked his whip without an oath. "Get along there, boys." As the serried lines of blue, with bayonets flashing in the warm sun of April, marched past the tall giant on horseback, they were in fine spirits. They cheered the president with rousing enthusiasm. John Vaughan did not join. He marched past with his eyes straight in front. The president hurried back to Washington to keep his vigil from the window overlooking the Potomac, and Hooker began the execution of his skillful plan of attack. On the day his advance began, he had 130,000 men and 448 great guns and 7 grand divisions. Lee, still lying in the Crescent Hills beyond Fredericksburg, had 62,000 men and 170 guns. He had detached Longstreet's corps for service in Tennessee. The Federal commander was absolutely sure that he could throw the flower of his magnificent army across the river 7 miles above Fredericksburg, get into Lee's rear, hurl the remaining of his forces across the river as Burnside had done, and crush the Gray Army like an eggshell. It was well planned, but in war the unexpected often happens. Again the unexpected thing turned up in the shape of the strange, dusty figure on his little sorrel horse. The night before Hooker moved, Julius met with an accident which delayed John's supper. He was just approaching the camp after a successful stroll over the surrounding territory, carrying on his back a sheep he meant to cook for the coming march. A rude and unsympathetic guard arrested him. Julius was greatly grieved at his unkind remarks. "Lordy, man, you ought not to say things like that to me. I never steal nothing in my life. I wasn't even foraging this time." "Hell, you weren't." "No, sir, I wasn't even foraging. I know that the general done issued them orders against it, and I quit long ago." "This sheep looks like it." "That sheep?" "That's what I said, you black thief." "Say, man, don't talk to me like that. You shows hurt my feelings. I never stole that sheep. I never go after them sheep I weren't studying about no animals. I was just walking along the road past the man's house where this big devilish-looking old sheep come running at me with his head down, and I lammed him with a stick to save my life, sir. And then when he fails, I know it was the pity to leave him there, spite, so I naturally had to fetch him into the camp to save him. Man, you sure is rude to talk that way." The guard was obdurate until Julius began to describe how he cooked roast mutton. He finally agreed to accept his version of the battle with the sheep as authentic if he would bring him a 10-pound roast to test the truth of his conversation. Julius was still harping on the rudeness of this guard as he fanned the flies off John's table with a sassafras brush at supper. "I don't know why they ever let such po' white trash is that man get into Army fo' anyhows," he exclaimed indignantly. "We have to take them as they come now, Julius. There's going to be a draft this summer. No more volunteers now. Wait till you see the conscripts. They can't be no worse than that man. He weren't no gemman at all, sir." John rose from his hearty supper and strolled along the line of his regiment, recruited again to its full strength, 1,200 men. Two fellows who were messmates were scrapping about a question of gravy. One wanted lots of gravy and his meat done brown. The other insisted on having his meat decently cooked but not swimming in grease. The man in favor of gravy was on duty as cook at this meal and stuck to his own ideas. They suddenly clinched, fell to the ground, rolled over, knocked the pan in the fire, and lost both meat and gravy. John smiled and passed on. A lieutenant was sitting on a stump holding a letter from his sweetheart to the flickering campfire. He bent and kissed the signature, the fool. For a moment the old longing surged back through his soul. He wondered if she ever thought of him now. She had loved him once. He started back to his tent to write her a letter before they broke camp. Nature was calling in the balmy spring night wind that floated over the waters of the river. Nature knew naught of water. She was pouring out her heart in budding leaf and blossom in the joy of living, and then the bitterness of shame and stubborn pride welled up to kill the tender impulse. There were slumbering forces beneath the skin. The scenes through which he was passing had called into new life. They were bringing new powers both of mind and body. They added nothing to the gentler, sweeter sources of character. He began to understand how men could feed their ambitions on the bodies of fallen hosts and still smile. He had felt the brutalizing touch of war. With a cynical laugh, he threw off his impulse to write and turned into his blanket, dreaming of the red carnival toward which they would march at dawn. As the sun rose over the new sparkling fields of the South on the morning of the 27th of April, 1863, the great movement began. The Federal commander ordered Sedgwick's division to cross the Rappahannock below Fredericksburg and deploy in line of battle to deceive Lee as to his real purpose, while he secretly marched his main army through the woods, 7 miles above, to throw them on his rear. As the men stood, thousands banked on thousands, awaiting the order to march, John Vaughan saw for the first time the grim procession pass along the lines carrying a condemned deserter to be shot to death before his former comrades. His hands were tied across his breast with a rough knotted rope, and he was seated on his coffin. The War Department had gotten around the tender heart in the White House at last. The desertions had become so terrible in their frequency, it was absolutely necessary to make examples of some of the men. The poor devil who sat forlornly on his grim throne, riding through the sweet spring morning, had no mother or sister or sweetheart to plead his case. The men stared in silence as the death cart rumbled along the lines. It halted, and the man took his place before the firing squad but a few feet away. A white cloth was bound over his eyes. The sergeant dealt out the specifically prepared round of cartridges, all blank save one. The dosed soldier might know who did the murder. In low tones they were ordered to fire straight at the heart of the blindfolded figure. The muskets flashed, and the man crumpled in a heap on the soft young grass. The blood poured from his breast in a bright red pool beside the quivering form. And then the army moved. The stratagem of the commander was executed with skill, but there was an eagle eye back of those hills of Fredericksburg. Lee was not only a great stark fighter, he was a past master in the arts of war. He had divined his opponent's plan from the moment of his first movement. By April 30th, Hooker had effected his crossing and slipped into the rear of Lee's left wing. The Southerner had paid little attention to Sedgwick's menace on the front. He left but 9,000 men on Marye's Heights to hold in check this 40,000, and by a rapid night march suddenly confronted Hooker in the wilderness before Chancellorsville. So strong was the Union general's position, he issued an order to his army in which he declared, "The enemy must now flee shamefully or come out of his defenses to accept battle on our own ground to his certain destruction." The enemy had already slipped out of his defenses before Fredericksburg, and at that moment was feeling his way through the tangled vines and undergrowth with sure, ominous tread. The soul of the Confederate leader rose with elation at the prospect before him. In this tangle called the wilderness, broken only here and there by small scattered farmhouses and fields, the Grand Army of the Republic had more than twice his numbers and nearly 3 times as many big guns, but his artillery would be practically useless. It was utterly impossible to use 400 great guns in such a woods. Lee's 170 would be more than he could handle. It would be a fight between infantry at close range. The Southerner knew that no army of men ever walked the earth. Who would be the equal, man for man, with those gray veteran dead shots who were now silently creeping through the undergrowth of their native woods? On May 1st, their 2 lines came into touch, and Lee felt of his opponent by driving in his skirmishers in a desultory fire of artillery. On the morning of May 2nd, the 2 armies faced each other at close range. With Sedgwick's division of 40,000 men now threatening Lee's rear from Fredericksburg, his army thus caught between 2 mighty lines of blue, Hooker was absolutely sure of victory. The one thing of which he never dreamed was that Lee would dare, in the face of such a death trap, to divide his own small army. And yet this is exactly what the Southerner decided to do, contrary to all of the rules of military science or the advice of the strange silent figure on the little sorrel horse. When Lee, Jackson, and Stuart rode along the lines of Hooker's front that fatal May morning, Jackson suddenly reined in his little sorrel and turned his keen blue eyes on his gray-haired chief. "There's just one way, General Lee. The front and left are too strong. I can swing my corps into a quick movement to the rear while you attack the front. They will think it's a retreat. Out of sight, I will turn, march for 10 miles around their right wing, and smash it from the rear before sundown." Lee quickly approved the amazing plan of his lieutenant, though it involved the necessity of holding Hooker's center and left in check, and that his 9,000 men behind the stone wall on Marye's Heights should hold Sedgwick's 40,000. He believed it could be done until Jackson had completed his march. He immediately ordered his attack on the center and left of his enemy. The artillery horses were cropping the tender dew-laden grass with eagerness. They had no breakfast. The riders sprang to their backs at 7 o'clock, and they dashed into position. Lee's guns opened the fateful day. For hours his lines blazed with the steady, sullen boom of artillery and the rattle of musketry. Hooker's host replied in kind. At noon, a shout swept the Federal lines that Lee's army was in retreat. Sickles' division could see the long gray waves hurrying to the rear. They were close enough to note the ragged, dirty, nondescript clothes Jackson's men wore. No man in all the Union host doubted for a moment that Lee had seen the hopelessness of his position and was hurrying to save his little army of 62,000 men from being crushed into a pulp by the jaws of 130,000 and 2 grand divisions closing in on him. It was a reasonable supposition, always barring the utterly unexpected, another name for Stonewall Jackson, who they seemed to have forgotten for the moment. Sickles, seeing the retreat, sent a courier flying to Hooker, asking for permission to follow the fugitives with his 20,000 men. Hooker consented, and Sickles leaped from the entrenchments and set out in a mad haste to overtake the flying columns. He got nearly 10 miles into the woods away from the battle lines before he realized that the ghostly men in gray had made good their escape. Certainly they had disappeared from the view. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon when Jackson's swift, silent marchers began to draw near to the unsuspecting right wing of Hooker's army under the command of General Howard. Ned Vaughn was in Jackson's skirmish line, feeling the way through the tender green foliage of the spring. The days were warm and the leaves far advanced, the woods so dense it was impossible for picket or skirmisher to see more than 100 yards ahead, at some points not even 100 feet. The thin, silent line suddenly swept into the little opening of a Negro cabin with a garden and patch of corn. A kindly old colored woman was standing in the doorway. She looked into the faces of those eager, slender Southern boys, and they were her children. The meaning of war was real to her, only when it meant danger to those she loved. She quickly ran up to Ned, her eyes dancing with excitement. "For the Lord's sake, honey, don't you boys go up that road no further." "Why, mammy?" he asked with a smile. "Lordy, child, there's thousands and thousands of them Yankees over that hill there. They'll kill every one of y'all." "I reckon not, mammy," Ned called, hurrying on. She ran after him, still crying, "For God's sake, come back here, honey. They'll kill you sure." She was still calling as Ned disappeared beyond the cabin into the woods, redolent now with the blossoms, achinican bushes, and the rich odors of sweet shrub. They climbed the little ridge on whose further slope lay an open field and caught their first view of Howard's unsuspecting division. They halted and sent their couriers flying with news to Jackson. Ned looked on the scene with a thrill of exultation and then a sense of deepening pity. The boys in blue had begun to bivouac for the night, their campfires curling through the young green leaves. The men were sitting in groups, laughing, talking, joking, playing cards. Their horses were busy cropping the young grass. "God have mercy on them," Ned exclaimed. It was nearly 6 o'clock before Jackson's men had all slipped silently into position behind the dense woods on this little slope in two grim battle lines, one behind the other, with columns in support, his horse artillery with their big guns shotted and ready. Ned saw a stir in the doomed camp of blue. The men were standing up now, looking curiously towards these dense woods. A startled flock of quail had swept over their head, flying straight down from the hill crest. A rabbit came scurrying from the same direction, and then another flock of quail swirled past and pitched among the campfires, running and darting in terror on the ground. An officer drew his revolver and potted one for his supper. The men glanced uneasily towards the woods, but could see nothing. "What do you reckon that means? What ails the poor birds and the rabbits?" They were not long in doubt. The sudden shrill note of a bugle rang from the woods, and Jackson's yelling gray lines of death swept down on their unprotected rear. The first regiments in sight were blown into atoms and driven as chaff before a whirlwind. Behind them lay 20 regiments in their trenches, pointed the wrong way. The men leaped to their guns and fought desperately to stave the rushing torrent. Beyond them was a ragged gap of a whole mile without a man, left bare by the trace of Sickles' division now 10 miles away. Without support, the shattered lines were crushed and crumpled and rolled back in confusion. Every regiment was cut to pieces and pushed on top of one another, men, horses, mules, cattle, guns, and a tangled mass of blood and death. Ned was sent on to bring the supporting column to drive them on and on. He mounted a horse and dashed back to the reserve lines, yelling his call. "Hurry, hurry up, men! What's the hurry?" growled a graycoat. "Hurry, hurry!" Ned shouted. "We've captured 50 pieces of artillery and 10,000 prisoners." "Then what ails the use of hurrying on an empty stomach? But we're coming, honey. We're coming." The colonel of a regiment snatched his hat off and was getting his men ready for the charge. He waved his hand towards Ned. "Make that damn fool get out of the way. I'm going to charge. Now you men listen. Listen to me. I say, not to that feller. Listen to me." Ned could hear him still talking excitedly to his eager men as he dashed back to the battle line. General Hooker sat on the porch of the Chancellor House, his headquarters. On the east there was heavy firing, where his men were attempting to carry out his orders to flank Lee's retreating army. Sickles and Pleasonton's cavalry were already in pursuit. By some curious trick of the breeze or atmospheric conditions, not a sound had reached him from the direction of his right wing. A staff officer suddenly turned his glasses to the west. My God, here they come. Before the astounded commander could leap from his porch to the horse, the flying stragglers of his shattered right were pouring into view, men, wagons, ambulances, in utter confusion. Hooker swung his old division under General Berry into line and shouted to his veterans, "Forward with the bayonet!" A sturdy division plowed its way through the receding blue waves of panic-stricken men and dashed into the face of overwhelming hosts. Major Keenan, in command of the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry, charged with his gallant 500 into the face of almost certain death and held the gray lines in check until the artillery of the 3rd Corps was saved and turned on the advancing Confederates. He fell at the head of his men. The fight now became a battle. It was no longer a rout. Ned saw a lone deaf man in blue, standing bareheaded, fighting a whole army, so intent on his work he hadn't noticed that his regiment had retreated and left him. 2 men in gray raised their muskets and fired point blank at this man. At the same instant, the unconscious hero fell. "I hit him," cried one. "No, I hit him," said the other, and they both rushed up and tenderly offered him help. A gray soldier came hurrying by, taking 2 prisoners to the rear. A cannonball from the rescued battery cut off his leg, and he dropped beside Ned, shouting hysterically, "Pick me up! Pick me up! Why don't you pick me up?" The blue prisoner looked back in terror at the battery and started to run. A gray soldier stopped them. Here, what the hell's the matter with you? Them's your own guns. What are you trying to get them away from me for?" Men were falling now at every step. Ned had advanced 100 yards further when the boy on his right suddenly threw his hands over his head and his leg fell to the ground, cut off by a cannonball. Ned leaped to his side and caught him in his arms. A look of anguish swept his strong young face as he gasped, "My poor old mother. Oh, my God, what'll she do now?" Ned tied his handkerchief around the mangled leg, twisted the knot and stayed the blood gushing from the severed arteries, and rushed back to his desperate work. 4 horses dashed by his side, dragging through the woods a big gun to train on the battery that was plowing through their lines. A solid shot crashed straight through the horse's head, blinding Ned with blood and brains. He threw his hand to his face and buried it in the hot, quivering mass, exclaiming, "My God, boys, my brains are blown out." "You got the biggest set I ever saw of them," the captain said, helping him to clear his eyes. A shell exploded squarely against the gun carriage, hurling it into junk and piling all 4 horses on the ground. Their dying cries rang pitifully through the smoke-wreathed woods. One horse lifted his head, placed both 4 feet on the ground, and tried to rise. His hind legs were only shreds of torn flesh. He neighed a long, quivering, soul-piercing shriek of agony, and a merciful officer drew his revolver and killed him. A cannoneer laid by this horse's side with both his legs hopelessly crushed so high in the thick flesh of the thighs there was no hope. He was moaning horribly. He turned his eyes in agony to the officer who had shot the horse. "Please, Captain, for the love of God, shoot me too. I can't live." The captain shook his head. "Have mercy on me, for Jesus' sake. Kill me. You were kind to my horse. Can't you do as much for me?" The captain turned away in anguish. He couldn't even send for morphine. The South had no more morphine. The blockade's iron hand was on her hospitals now. Ned fought for half an hour behind a tree. Twice the bullets striking the bark knocked pierces into his eyes. He was sure at least 50 mini balls struck it. A bald-headed colonel rushed by at double quick, leading a fresh regiment into action to support them. The hell of battle was not so hot to the Southern soldier that he had lost his sense of humor. They were glad to see this dashing old fighter, and they told him so, in no uncertain terms. "Hurrah for Baldy! Sick 'em, Baldy, sick 'em! I bet on old man Baldy every time. Hurrah for the bald-headed man!" The colonel paid no attention to their shouts. The flash of his muskets in the deepening twilight turned the tide in their favor. The big guns had been unlimbered and pulled back deeper into the blue lines. John Vaughan's line was swung to support the charge of Hooker's old division, which first halted the rush of Jackson's men. In a field beyond the Chancellor House stood a huge straw stack. As the regiment rushed by at double quick, the colonel spied a panic-stricken officer crouching in terror behind the pile. The colonel slapped him across the shoulders with his sword. What sort of place is this for you, sir? Through chattering teeth came the trembling response. Why, my God, do you think the bullets can come through? The colonel threw up his hands in rage and pressed on with his men. A wagon loaded with entrenching tools on which sat half a dozen Negroes rattled by on its way to the rear. A solid shot plumped squarely into the load. John saw picks, spades, shovels, and Negroes suddenly fill the air. Every Negro lit on his feet, and his legs were running when he struck the ground. They reached the tall timber before the last pick fell. The regiments were going into battle double quick, but they were not going so fast they couldn't laugh. Hurry up, men, the colonel called. Hurry up, let's get in there and help 'em. A moment more, and they were in it. The man beside John threw up both hands and dropped with the dull, unmistakable thud of death. The soldier who had been in battle knows the sickening sound. They were thrown around the 3rd Corps battery to protect their guns, which had been dragged in place more securely within the lines. Still, their gunners kept falling one by one, ominous at the crack of a single gun in the woods. A Confederate sharpshooter had climbed a tree and was picking them off. A tall Westerner spoke to the colonel. Let me go hunting for him. The commander nodded, and John went with him. Why? He asked himself the question before he had taken 10 steps through the shadowy underbrush. The answer was plain. He knew the truth at once. The elemental, brutal instinct of the hunter had kindled at the flash in that Westerner's eye. It would be a hunt worthwhile. The game was human. For 5 minutes, they crept through the bushes, hiding from tree to tree in the open spaces. They searched the tops in vain when suddenly a piece of white oak bark fluttered down from the sky and struck the ground at their feet. The Westerner smiled at John and stood motionless. Well, I'm damned. They waited breathlessly, afraid to look into the boughs of the towering oak beneath which they were standing. Don't move now, the man from the west cried, and I'll pot him. Slowly he stepped backwards, softly, noiselessly, his eyes fixed on the treetop, his gun raised and finger on the trigger. He stopped, aimed, and fired. John looked up and saw the gray figure fall back from the tree trunk and plunge downward, bounding from limb to limb and striking the ground within 10 feet of where he stood with a heavy thud. The blood was gushing in red streams from his nose and mouth. They turned and hurried back to their lines. Another fierce attack was being made on those guns. The men in gray charged and drove them back 100 feet before they rallied and pushed them back with frightful losses on both sides. John's captain fell dangerously wounded and lay 50 feet beyond their battle lines. The dry leaves in the woods had taken fire from a shell, and the blaze was nearing the wounded men. The Westerner coolly leaped from his position behind a tree, walked out in a hail of lead, picked up his wounded commander, and carried him to safety in the rear. He had just stepped back to take his stand in line by John's side when a flying piece of shrapnel tore a hole in his side. He dropped to his knee, sank lower at his elbow, turned his blue eyes to the darkening sky, and slowly muttered as if to himself, "Poor little wife and babies." The night was drawing a merciful veil over the scene at last. Jackson, having crushed and mangled Hooker's right wing and rolled it back in red defeat over 5 miles in 2 hours, was slowly feeling his way back on his last reconnaissance for the day to make his plans for the next. Through a fatal misunderstanding, he was fired on by his own men and borne from the field fatally wounded. A shiver of horror thrilled the Southerners when the news of Jackson's fall was whispered through the darkness. At midnight, Sickles led his division back into the dense woods, and for 3 terrible hours the men on both sides fought as demons in the shadows. The long lines of blazing muskets in the darkness looked like the onward rush of a forest fire. At times, 2 solid walls of flame seemed to leap through the treetops into the starlit heavens. A small portion of the captured ground was recovered at a frightful loss, and no man knows to this day how many gallant men in blue were shot down by their own comrades in the darkness and confusion of that mad assault. Hooker sent a desperate call to Sedgwick to hurry to his relief by carrying out his plans of sweeping Marist Heights and falling on Lee's rear. At dawn, Stewart, in command of Jackson's corps, led the new charge on Hooker's lines, his gray veterans shouting, "Remember Jackson." Through the long hours of the terrible 3rd day of May, the fierce combat of giants raged. During the morning, Hooker's headquarters were reached by the Confederate artillery, and the old Chancellor House, filled with the wounded, was knocked to pieces and set on fire. The women and children and slaves of the Chancellor family were shivering in the cellar, while the shells were hurling its bricks and timbers in murderous fury on the helpless wounded who lay in hundreds in the yard. The men from both armies rushed into this hell and carried the wounded to a place of safety. General Hooker was wounded, and the report flew over the Federal Army that he had been killed. To allay their fears, the general had himself lifted into the saddle and rode down his lines and out of sight when he was taken unconscious from his horse. Sedgwick was fighting his way with desperation now to force Mary's Heights and strike Lee's rear. Once more the stone wall blazed with death for the gallant men in blue. They dashed themselves against it wave on wave, only to fall back into confusion. They tried to flank it and failed. Hour after hour the mad charges rolled against the hill and broke in deep red pools at its base. They were but 9,000 men holding against 40,000, but it was afternoon before the gray line slowly gave way and Sedgwick's victorious troops poured over the hill towards Lee's lines. The long rows and mangled heaps of the dead left on Mary's bloody slopes was sufficient answer to all inquiries as to his delay. But the way was still blocked. The receding line of gray was suddenly supported by Early's division, detached from Lee's reserves. Again Sedgwick was stopped and fought till dark. As the sun was sinking over the smoke-wreathed, spring-clothed trees of the wilderness, Stuart gathered Jackson's corps for a desperate assault on Hooker's last line of defense. Waving the plumed hat high above his handsome, bearded face, he put himself at the head of his troops and charged, chanting with boyish enthusiasm his improvised battle song. Old Joe Hooker, won't you come out of the wilderness, come out of the wilderness, come out of the wilderness. Old Joe Hooker, come out of the wilderness, come, come, I say. The cheering gray wave swept all before them and left Lee in full possession of Chancellorsville and the whole position of the Federal Army had originally held. As the Confederates rolled on, driving the fiercely fighting men in blue before them, Lee himself rode forward to encourage his men, and then it happened, the thing for which the great have fought and longed and dreamed since time dawn, the spontaneous tribute of the brave and trusted leader. His victorious troops went wild at the sight of him. Above the crash and roar of the battle rose the shouts of the Southerners. Hurrah for Lee! 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 From the lip to lip, the thrilling name leaped until the wounded and dying turned their eyes to see and raised their feeble voices. Lee! 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 It was at this moment that he received the note from Jackson, announcing that he was badly wounded. With the shouts of his men ringing in his ears, he drew his pencil and wrote across the pommel of his saddle, General, I've just received your note informing me that you are wounded. I cannot express my regret at the occurrence. Could I have directed events, I should have chosen for the good of the country to be disabled in your stead. I congratulate you upon the victory which is due to your skill and energy. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, Robert E. Lee, General. It was quick, bloody work the next day for the Southerner to turn and spring on Sedgwick with the ferocity of a tiger, crush and hurled his battered and bleeding corps back on the river. Under the cover of a storm, General Couch, in command of Hooker's army, retreated back across the Rappahannock. The blue and gray picket lines that night were so close to each other that men could talk freely. The Southern boys were chaffing the Northerners over their oft-repeated defeats. Through a darkness, a Yankee voice drawled, Johnny, shut up. You make us tired. You're not so much as you think you are. Swap generals with us and we'll come over and lick the hell out of you. A silence fell over the boasting ones, and then to the listening Yankees heard a low-voiced chuckle to his comrade. I'm damned if they wouldn't, too. With the gray dawn broke through the storm, they began to bury the dead and care for the wounded. The awful struggle had ended at last. The Northern Army had lost 17,000 men, the Southerners 13,000. It was a great victory for the South, but a few more such victories, and there would be none of her brave boys left to tell the story. John Vaughan's company had been detailed to help in cleaning the field. The day before, on Sunday morning, they had eaten their breakfast seated on the ground among hundreds of dead bodies whose odor poisoned the air. It is needless to say Julius was not present. He had kept the river between him and the roar of the contending hosts. The suffering of the wounded had been terrible. Some of them had fallen on Friday, thousands on Saturday, and it was now Monday. All through the blood-soaked, tangled woods they lay groaning and dying, and everywhere the flap of black wings, the keen-eyed vultures had seen from the sky where they fell. John found a brave old farmer from northern New York lying beside his son. He had met them in the fight at Fredericksburg in December. "Well, here we are, Vaughn," the father cried feebly. "My boy's dead, and I'll be with him soon, but it's all right. It's all right. My country's worth it." They were lying in a bright open space where the warm sun of May had pushed the wood violets into blossom in rich profusion. The dead boy's head lay in a bed of blue flowers. Some of the bodies further on were black and charred by the flames that had swept the woods again and again during the battles. Some of them had been wounded men, and they had been burned to death. Their twisted bodies and the agony on their cold faces told the hideous story more plainly than words. The odor of burning flesh still filled the air in those black spots. With a start, John suddenly came on the crouching figure of a Confederate soldier kneeling behind a stump. The paper end of the cartridge was in his teeth, and his fingers still grasped the ball. He was just in the act of tearing the paper as a bullet crashed straight through his forehead. A dark streak of blood marked his face and clothes. His gun was in his other hand, the muzzle in place to receive the cartridge, the body cold and rigid, exactly in the position death had called him. A broad-shouldered, bearded man in blue had just fallen asleep nearby. The body was still warm, his blue eyes wide open, staring into the leaden sky. On his breast lay an open Bible with a bloody finger mark on the lines, "The Lord's my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He restoreth my soul." 100 yards further lay a dead boy from his own company. The stiff hands were still holding a picture of his sweetheart before his staring eyes. Near him lay a boy in gray with the sweetheart's letter clasped in his hand. They had talked and tried to cheer one another. These dying boys talked of those they loved in far-off villages as the mists of eternity had gathered about them. It was late that night before the wounded had all been moved. Through every hour of its black watches, the surgeons, with their sleeves rolled high, their arms red, bent over their tasks, until legs and arms were piled in ghastly heaps 10 feet high. As John Vaughn turned from the scene where he had laid a wounded man to wait his turn, his eyes caught the look of terror on the face of a wounded Southern boy. He was a slender, little dark-haired fellow under 16, a miniature of Ned. The surgeon had just taken up his knife to cut into the deep flesh wound for the mini-ball embedded there. John saw the slender face go white, and the terror-stricken young eyes searched the room for help. His breath came in quick gasps, and he was about to faint. John slipped his arm around him. "Just a minute, doctor." He pressed his hand and whispered, "Come now, little man, you're among your enemies. You've got to be brave. Show your grit for the South. I've got a brother in your army who looks like you. No white feather now when the Yankees can see you." The slender figure stiffened and his eyes flashed. "All right," the sturdy lips cried. "Let him go ahead. I'm ready now." John held his hand while the knife cut through the soft young flesh and found the lead. The grip of the slim fingers tightened, but he gave no cry. John handed him the bullet to put in his pocket and left him smiling his thanks. He began to wonder vaguely if he had lost his cook forever. Julius should have found the regiment before this. It was just before a day that he came on him, working with might and main at a job that was the last one on earth he would have selected. He had been seized by a burying squad and put to work dragging corpses to the trenches from the great piles where the wagons had dumped them. The black man rolled his eyes in piteous appeal to his master. "For God's sake, Master John, save me. These here men won't let me go. I've been here throwing corpses into them trenches since dark. I's most dead from work, let alone be scared to death." "Sorry, Julius," was the quick reply. We all got to work at a time like this. There's no help for it." Julius bent again to his horrible task. The thing that appalled him was the way the dead men kept looking at him, out of their eyes wide and staring in the flickering light of the lanterns. John stood watching him thoughtfully. He had finished one pile of bodies, dragging them by the heels, one by one, and throwing them into the trenches. He was just about to begin on the last stack when he saw that he had left one lying a little further in the shadows. Julius looked at it dubiously and scratched his head. He didn't like the idea of going so far back in the dark away from the light, but there was no help for it. The guard stood with his musket scowling. "Get a move on, you, damn you! Don't stand there," he growled. Julius walled his eyes at his tormentor and ran for the body. It happened to be the sleeping form of a tired guard who'd been up 3 nights. The Negro grabbed his legs and rushed towards the light and trenches. He had almost reached the grave when the corpse gave a vicious kick and yell. "Here, what the hell?" Julius didn't stop to look to answer. What he felt in his hands was enough. With a yell of terror, he dropped the thing and he plunged straight ahead. "God save me!" His foot slipped on the edge of the trench, and he rolled into the dark hole. With the leap of a frightened panther, he reached the solid earth and flew, each leap a muttered prayer. "Save me, Lord, save me!" Standing there beside the grim piles of his dead comrades, John Vaughn joined the guard in uncontrollable laughter. It was many a day before he saw his cook again. The laughter suddenly stopped, and he turned from the scene with a shudder. "I wonder, if I live through this war, whether I'll come out of it with a soul." The report from Chancellorsville drifted slowly, ominously, appallingly over Washington with the clouds and mists of the storm which swept up from the Potomac and shrouded the city in a gray mantle of mourning. The White House was still. The dead were walking through its great rooms of state. The anguished heart, who watched by the window toward the hills of Virginia, saw and heard each muffled footfall. He walked to the table with stumbling, uncertain steps at last, his face ghastly and rigid, its color gray, ashes. His deep-set eyes, streaming with tears, sank helplessly into a chair and for the first time gave way to despair. "Oh, my God, what will the country say?" End of chapter 27.